Welcome back to pixelprojectradio, the video game discussions podcast where we do deep dives and analyze all of our favorite games, and some of yours too. My name is Rick, I am your host as always, and today is one for the books as we pour through Pentiment, a 2022 historical fiction murder mystery from Obsidian Entertainment. This episode, like every episode, is brought to you by our patrons. Thank you, patrons. You too can be like these fine folks by visiting patreon.com/pixelprojectradio. We'll talk more about plugs and socials towards the end. I am joined once again by friend of the show, Nick from Friday Night Gamecast. He's been on previous episodes before, most recently the Xenosaga episode, and today, well, he's here again. Thanks for joining me, Nick. How's it going?
It's wonderful. Thank you so much for having me back on. I'm really excited. This is a very important game to me, so I was glad that you reached out to touch base with me on jumping into this today. So I'm excited to be here.
Me too, man. I'm really glad that you agreed to join me on this. Shocked isn't the right word, but I was so pleasantly surprised at how much this game resonated with me and how much I enjoyed it. So I'm glad that you had the same experience and you came on to talk with me about it. That kind of leads us directly into the meat of the discussion. We're not wasting any time today. We're getting right into it.
That's right.
Well, actually, I do have to say one thing. Up top, this is episode 1 of 2. There's going to be 2 parts to this analysis of Pentiment. If you're a new listener, first of all, thank you for joining us. I'm really happy you're here. I hope that you like the work that we do. The spoiler policy for our episodes, as always, is we won't spoil anything until we start talking about the story. So we will have to talk about some things in the game, but as far as narrative plot points, we won't spoil any of those until the story discussion begins, at which time we tend to try and keep them sequentially ordered. In other words, we won't spoil the ending if we're talking about the middle of the game. But just know, going into it, that spoilers will not happen until the story discussion begins. So if you're on the fence of Pentiment, you can tune in now and drop out whenever we get there and play the game for yourself, which I hope you do.
You got to make sure to not spoil yourself with this episode and experience it firsthand.
So that kind of segues nicely into the beginning, like I said before. That kind of takes us into our opening discussion and personal histories. So when did you first play this game, Nick? I know it's newer. It came out at the end of 2022, so it's not like either of us can have a ton of nostalgia for this, but did you play this when it first came out?
Yeah, this was a day one launch game for me. This has been something that had been on my radar for quite a while. Obviously, buying into the Xbox Series X, at launch and getting into the Xbox ecosystem. Obviously, when they, did this fresh new generation with the Xbox Series as well as the PS5, and obviously with Microsoft's push towards the Game Pass model, they had several different showcases in the past, and Pentiment had been something that had popped up on my radar. And obviously, I've very much enjoyed, with mixed reviews, other Obsidian games in the past that I've played. I've enjoyed the work that they've done before, and I also enjoy, some of the leadership team that was on Pentiment, their work before in various games, such as Fallout New Vegas. But I didn't know what to expect of this game, other than the fact that when it was displayed at the showcase, that the art style was just absolutely incredible, and it seemed to have a really good sense of humor about it. So when it dropped on Game Pass day one as a first party Xbox title, I decided to jump in and start playing it at launch.
Nice. Okay. And you played it on Xbox, you said?
Yes, I bounced in between playing it on the Xbox as well as just the PC Game Pass module, and so that's been primarily where I'm jumping around. And this is a great game as well, because obviously it's nice kind of engaging with it through the Xbox ecosystem, because I can bounce from the console as well as the computer, and even play on my ROG Ally, which is very, very good for a game like this, especially since it's kind of so much of the experience, is reading and kind of being familiar and aware of the different environments. It's a perfect handheld game in my book.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. This game really excels on handheld. As for me, I didn't play it at launch. I knew about it at launch, but I ended up playing it in early 2023. And, just to get my feelings out in the open now, it immediately became one of my favorite games of 2023. I think, I do at the end of the year, every year I do a little list, a listicle, a countdown of the games that I liked the most that I played for the first time that year. And I also write for Offshore Gamecast, who I think they're on hiatus right now, but they tend to do a game of the year every year lists. And Pentiment was number one. It just, there wasn't a question in 2023. Yeah. This was my favorite game that I played. I played it on handhelds, Steam Deck, Legion Go, on my PC, a little bit on PS5. I did pre-order it from Limited Run, which I have.
Oh wow! Okay.
I feel a little queasy about. I'm not the biggest fan of limited run games, but I make exceptions. Like I made an exception for Night in the Woods because that's a game that means a lot to me. I'm making exception for this. I thought about doing it for Tomba because that game means a lot to me, but it just seems like they kind of ported it, and I'm not really about that. But anyway, I played this across everything. It works great. You said it works great on Xbox, so it doesn't matter where you play this. Just play it.
Excellent experience, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Just to get some facts and figures out of the way, I did want to go over some of the folks that worked on this game. You can find the full credits on the IMDb and on the wiki and in the game's credits, but of note, I wanted to mention the developer, Obsidian Entertainment, as you said, directed by Josh Sawyer, also written by Josh Sawyer. We're going to talk about him in a second here. The artist was Hannah Kennedy. The composers, arrangers, I should say, was the Alchemy Early Music Ensemble, which we'll talk about them some more as well. This game is also on Switch. I don't think, if you mentioned that and I missed it, Nick, I apologize. But this game is also on Switch. I imagine it runs fine on there too.
Yeah.
So we mentioned Josh Sawyer. You mentioned that you had some mixed feelings about games from Obsidian. I haven't really played too many games from Obsidian. I think... I played New Vegas, but I, notoriously never finished it. I say notoriously like people know who I am. I played a little bit of Outer Worlds, which I found to be profoundly middling, very, very average.
That was what I was getting at earlier, whereas I went into the Outer Worlds, with everybody, the hype surrounding that game and Obsidian being like, oh, they know how to tell a wonderful RPG story. And I went in, I put in like 40 hours, I got through a couple of worlds, and I was just like, this just isn't for me, and I bounced off.
It doesn't have the teeth that it needs to tackle the subject matter that it's trying to. It's perfectly fine. Like, it's not bad. I just, it felt very safe, and I wanted more than that. But Josh Sawyer did not work on that game. Josh Sawyer did work on Pentiment. This is kind of his baby. This is kind of his baby. I had to retake that because I went through puberty for a second there. Josh has a degree in history with a focus in the Holy Roman Empire, and which is funny because he's also a self-proclaimed atheist. And this game takes place essentially in that exact time period. There are two wonderful YouTube videos that I'm going to link in the sources in the episode description. One is a talk that Josh gave himself, as well as another YouTube channel that interviewed Josh Sawyer. It's a Catholic gaming YouTube channel that talks all about faith and his degree in history, making faith-based characters in some of his other games too. It's very, very fascinating stuff, and it's straight from the guy that made the game, so you can't get a more primary source than that. So I'll link those in the description. They're very fascinating. This game, Pentiment, I suppose we should just preface with what this game is. It is a murder mystery that takes place in the first half of the 16th century, a time of great upheaval leading to the Great Reformation. You're playing as journeyman and artist Andreas Mahler, who is loosely based on one historical figure as well as the protagonist to a book called The Name of the Rose. And you are getting wrapped up in the town of Tassing's affairs as you try to solve a series of murders that happens while you're there. That is a bird's eye view of what this game is. Now, are you a big mystery guy, Nick?
I adore mystery novels, murder mystery thrillers. that sort of thing. That's what kind of it made up the bulk of a lot of 90s flicks, of 90s blockbusters, and that's what I cut my teeth on as a film critic, a young film critic, young Nicholas, watching with his family back in the day. And to prepare for this episode, I actually went and I rented the obviously the film adaptation of The Name of the Rose that was starring Christian Slater and Sean Connery. It was Sean Connery and Christian Slater, with Sean Connery portraying William of Baskerville. And yeah, I love this sort of thing. And when I realized jumping into this game for the first time, oh my goodness, this you are literally just playing a detective and solving murder mysteries. And there have been so many of my other favorite games in recent history have revolved around investigations and murder mysteries in and of itself. I just fell into this game and was pleasantly surprised at how deep and rich it was.
Okay. I myself am not as big of a mystery buff as I think you are. I like a good mystery story. I mean, Disco Elysium is a mystery technically, and I love that game. Danganronpa, I like those okay.
Yeah.
But for me, actually, what jumped out at me immediately was this being historical religious fiction, which I'm a big fan of. Asterisk. I need to put that asterisk there. Not religious fiction like Left Behind, like that book series that I feel like everybody's moms read when we were kids. But I don't often seek out religious historical fiction, and when I do find it, I'm not always, I don't always love it because it can come off a certain way. But when it's done well, as it is here, I'm all about it. I'm a really big fan, and this does it exponentially well. We've both mentioned The Name of the Rose. That's a book by Umberto Eco, an Italian author, and that book heavily inspired Pentiment. In that talk that Josh Sawyer gave, he characterizes The Name of the Rose as being about, quote, among other things, the revelation of truth through loss and the fragile nature of history. And I think that is just a perfect segue into Pentiment.
Absolutely. I found that I won't say that the two pieces of work of The Name of the Rose as well as Pentiment are a one-to-one translation because, as you said before, obviously this is an iteration. This is a historical fiction, and it was heavily inspired by The Name of the Rose. But it is so much. It seems so familiar when you go into it and you start playing as the different characters or start introducing to the different characters that are within the town of Tassing, and you start getting a grip with what the gameplay loop is going to be like. And I just, again, to your point, obviously through the poignancy of what it was like, I think this game, what it does better than almost any other game of its genre, even if you're talking about direct comparisons to what it's trying to do here in the experience, it immerses the player and truly makes them feel on a very intimate level what it was like to live in that period of time, what it was like to experience class stratification, what it was like to live when the church was all encompassing in society and having to organize your life around that. And I thought that there were so many powerful moments that you experience through the protagonist in this game that it's just like, it's not something that you really get from any other game, especially a game that's going to come from, for lack of a better word, a AAA studio like Obsidian. So this game truly is, to me, kind of like a rare unicorn in and of itself, and I'm so happy it exists.
I like that you're honing in so focusedly on this notion of familiarity, because that is one of the minor themes, I think, in Pentiment. And Josh Sawyer mentioned this in that talk that he gave. I apologize for mentioning this talk so much, but it's a special thing whenever you get so much good material from the creator itself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's kind of hard not to. But I can't remember if this was a point that he made or just an offhanded remark, like that served as a transition into something else. But he mentioned that we often tend to think of people in the past, in the far past, in the distant past, as being so different from who we are today. But that is not so. They very much are so similar to who we are. They experience things like loss. They experience things like depression, even if linguistically that word didn't exist. They experience things like class struggle. And then more light things like fooling around, flirting with the girl that you
Yeah.
like, being afraid to ask out the girl that you like,
Yeah.
things like that. They are so similar to us, and it's something that I struggle with myself. Whenever you're reading about history or thinking about the past, it's like, gosh, I can't imagine living there. I'm so sorry to keep talking, but I just saw on TikTok the other night. I'm still letting my brain rot on TikTok, but I saw like old bloopers, like in films, when everybody's speaking in transatlantic accent and they're doing film lines, and they'll mess up and everybody just like laughs it off, or they'll like say something like, "And I can't remember my fucking line," and it's like they really are just like we are.
There has been no change in human evolution or human behavior in so long, and I think that's something that we lose sight of when it comes to accessing pieces of history. That these people truly were humans that experienced the same struggle as us. Sure, maybe they spoke a different language, maybe they worshipped a different faith at that point in time, but I think that one of the downfalls of history, or at least how we as in a modern society access history, is that it is very sterilized, and we don't have the capacity to kind of look at it, or very often the way that it's relayed to us is put into the context of something that is so dry, and something that for lack of a better word, just doesn't really make people care about either moments in history or people in history. And that's something that this game does exceedingly well in terms of just making you care about the characters. And I think that it's something that obviously Josh had mentioned when he was, talking about the development of this game, is that, writing history in the margins of history gave him a lot of room to create these characters that were relatable and that were able to touch the character on an emotional level. So I just thought it was so great that we got the chance to experience that.
History is a foundation, not a prison. I think that was one of his bullet points, and illustrates what you're saying so well.
Yeah.
I'm not going to rank the themes. Neither of us are going to rank the themes of this, because that's a little bit reductive. But we mentioned this idea of familiarity with people of the past. That's certainly one of the themes. Another big theme that you had touched on is this idea of class stratification, class warfare, the struggles of different classes. That is a really major theme that's going to be coming up throughout this work, especially because your viewpoint character, Andreas, is not in tune with the peasants and the common folk. He comes from privilege. He was able to go to university, although he dropped out. He spent years wandering, the Wanderjahre, wandering years. That's why they call it. That's in the name. He's an artist. I mean, he doesn't fundamentally understand the toils and the plights of the common folk, and that is highlighted throughout this game to a great degree. This historically speaking too, the German Peasants' War took place around this time in the early 16th century. So this is very much things that happened. It's nothing new. History is never changing.
Right. And I just think it is so fascinating, kind of where we're starting this. We're starting the conversation. We're beginning the game. We're beginning to interact with Andreas in Medias Res, and it's so fascinating to know where, as the player, you're picking. He has an understanding of law. He has an understanding of nature, whatever it may be. Whatever Andreas that you want to play as is very well learned. And apparently, he's a dropout from university, which, according to the creators, was a very rare thing for that time. But he dropped out because he did want to pursue his artistic interest, which was a common thing at that point in time. But it's so fascinating to see him. Obviously, and they do the perfect thing where they place Andreas in the home of the Gertners, who are, if you're just looking at the face, maybe one of the poorest families in the game, and they welcome him into his home, and that's where you start out. In seeing how Andreas interacts with the different family members. As you go through there, you learn more about the town through them. And not to try to get too far ahead of myself, I just think it's really fascinating seeing the contrasting difference of behaviors and personalities between the monks of the abbeys. I don't know if are they monks or are they friars. I'm not sure if there's a negligible difference, but obviously the priests that are at the abbey at this point in time compared to the town folk. And you have in your notes here, obviously, Rick, that this is the point in time where the Germanic Peasants' War took place. And so that's obviously a focal point that they were able to hone in on and make very apparent. And I just thought it's so interesting to kind of play on the dynamics of that and how that feeds into the overall mystery, how that feeds into how people interact with each other, or the information that you can get from one character or another. It's fascinating.
I love that you're touching on this. I'm going to gently nudge us along, not because I don't think this conversation is interesting, but I don't want to exhaust all of our fuel on this now. We've got to save a couple of our arrows in our quiver, right?
Absolutely,
because
100%. We got to save it.
listeners, we promise you, this stuff is very baked into the game. We will talk about it. Two more themes that I wanted to talk about before we move on. We mentioned the church. This is very much a sort of Catholic regime when the church was in power. Although the 16th century, this is where it begins to sort of shift. Power struggles change, power dynamics change, and the Catholic Church loses power. I was raised Catholic, which, take that for what it's worth. This game activated me in many ways. So maybe my experience will come. I doubt my experience will come up, but a lot of this felt familiar to me. But one more, the major theme that both of us have danced around, and we're now going to address it, is this idea of pentimento. So Nick, I don't know about you. I had never heard of this art technique before.
I had only heard about it through the game, and that's what made me look it up and realize that, obviously it's about what lays beneath.
Yes. I don't remember if this is from Merriam-Webster or Britannica because I cross-referenced their definitions. I'm single, by the way, just in case anybody's curious. Pentimento is a reappearance in a painting of an original drawn or painted element which was eventually painted over by the artist. So when an artist, they had to reuse materials, right? So they would paint over other paintings, maybe make edits, corrections, changes. And over time, the paint fades and the original starts to be seen from underneath. This is central to the game's thematic identity. It makes up the essence of this work's core. This idea that history is always underneath, and though we may try to change it, we can never forget about it. This game centers around how history is shaped and written and retold. Often, history is written and told by powerful men, right? The powerful men of history. There's nothing inherently wrong. Again, I think I'm summarizing something that Josh Sawyer said, so apologies. I don't think Josh Sawyer will ever listen to this. If you do, we love you and your work.
We love you, Josh.
He mentioned there's nothing inherently wrong with the great men of history, right? Because great men of history have done great things. However, given the time period, that means marginalized groups and criminalized groups like Romani people, for example, one of which appears in this game, they do not get written about or had the same opportunities as these great men of history. So this idea of realistic representation, not creating a new power fantasy, but creating this is probably what happened and how it was, even though it wasn't written about because of societal norms. It's very refreshing and it's handled exceptionally well. I just can't gush enough about this theme. I love this idea that the past stays with you, and how do we grapple with it, and how do we teach the next generation, and in the context of a religious work, come on, home run.
Yeah, and that's a theme within itself, obviously. You're talking about teaching the errors of your ways that are passed on to the next generation. You see that reflected in multiple children that exist in this game, and then multiple parental or authority figures who are responsible for overseeing them. Talking about, obviously, and that feeds into as well, the fragile nature of history. It goes hand in hand, with the great man theory of how history is told. And it is one of the downsides of having to go back and look at the past, because we only have a lens with which we've been presented. And of course, there are linguistic historians, there are forensic historians whose entire job is dedicated towards, going back and looking beneath the surface of what we have been told or what has been relayed to try and find the truth. And that's what, again, is so riveting about this experience, because you are acting like that in turn, as well as the main character.
Yeah, absolutely. Observing the pentimento, I suppose, that naturally exists and can never go away. It's terrific. Again, just like the other themes, this is going to come up a lot. So we're going to save some of the fuel in our tank, the arrows in our quiver, whatever metaphor you like. We're going to save it. But just know we will expound and extol upon this. Mechanically, let's talk mechanics. This shouldn't take very long at all. This is a very simple game. I don't know. Should I read what I wrote? I'm just going to read what I wrote.
You got to. You have to.
You be walking and talking. That's kind of it.
Sometimes you do be doing that.
That's kind of it. And that some people would call this a qualified recommendation. I kind of side with the Disco Elysium devs on this, where it's like you read Twitter all day, or I guess now it would be Blue Sky or Instagram. Well, not Blue Sky. Blue Sky doesn't exist outside of chronically online people. Let's be honest. But you read Twitter all day. Like, why is reading so hard in a video game? I don't know. But that is the large majority of this game. You're exploring, you're talking, you're learning. But there are mini games in this, and we haven't talked about these off mic. So I'm wondering what you think about them. I kind of wonder if this wasn't a condition from the publishers, like agreeing to publish the game. Do you know what I mean? Like there has to be something more than walking and reading, because I don't really think they're additive in any way.
Yeah, I think that I didn't necessarily have any issues with it, but I feel like it's almost, to be frank with you, I did not engage with the mini games too deeply. I saw that it was presented, and I maybe lost one of the games once, especially when you're playing, cards in the tavern, and I was like, I don't understand this now, and I don't really want to learn it, so I just kept it pushing.
Oh, that Lasquent or something?
Yeah, exactly.
I somehow won everybody's money. I don't know how I did it.
Really?
I just kept betting.
I think there's an achievement
roll high,
that's
baby.
tied to that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, there sure is. And I earned it.
Yeah.
I stumbled into it is probably the better way to put that.
Yeah. I don't know if maybe it was just an off day for me or what it was, but obviously I failed in that, and there are numerous opportunities that were presented to you as you go throughout the different areas of the game, or you're at different moments in time, obviously, when you're expected to go and speak to different people, and obviously the mini games present themselves. But you're 100% right. Like, I could not care less of it. It's not the meat and potatoes of this game, and I don't really see, of course, like, obviously, as you had mentioned before, this could be a qualified recommendation. Again, if for people who don't like reading, I'm going to tell you straight up, you're not going to like this game, because it's the bread and butter of what makes this experience in Pentiment. So obviously that's not going to be for that audience. However, when it comes to the mini games, there isn't something, so it was baked in to the extent of being historically accurate for the time and the setting that they were taking place, but none of it really screamed to me like, oh, I have to do this. I have to check this box. I have to make sure I engage with these NPCs because I'm trying to min-max my character. It was very much a deft touch on the development team side for me to say, oh, I can engage with it if I want to, but it's not gonna define my playthrough if I choose to just walk away.
Yeah, I don't know. There's not much to talk about with them. They're there. Yeah. They changed the pace up a little bit.
Yeah,
it's fine. They're not overly offensive. There was one, I think, that we won't get to today that was maybe a little frustrating, but if I can't remember it, it couldn't have been that bad,
Yeah, I did have a question for you though before we move on really quick,
sure.
Rick. Is obviously you had mentioned it before. We had talked about a little bit of different games that could be potentially tied to this game as kind of analogs of the experience, but you had mentioned Danganronpa, and that is the only experience I had really had with a proper visual novel. And that is like it, and the gameplay loop here is very much, and I don't know if you disagree with me totally on this, but it's very much tied one for one with how you solve the mysteries in Danganronpa. I was curious, like, to see if have you seen those similarities, or do you think it's very loose at its core?
I wouldn't say that they're one to one. Personally, I think they're in the same chapter of a book, but the framework, the skeleton is there, right? The big difference though is, and this kind of ties into, I don't think this is a spoiler, so I'm just going to say it. If you don't want to take the chance, skip forward like 45 seconds to a minute. But the big difference here is that Danganronpa has a clear person that did it, right? A clear perpetrator.
Yes.
This game is not that. this game does not deal with hard black and white. It is very much a series of gray areas, which we'll get into whenever we get to the trials. But
Right.
If nothing else, that's what bucks the 1-to-1 label for me personally.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of see what your take was on that, because I even played Danganronpa and I got through maybe one or two of the class meetings where you choose who to accuse in that, and then I just kind of was like, oh, well, we'll see if we can get back to this at some point in time and let it go away. But I feel like at its core, Pentiment is very different and obviously modernized, as well as and this kind of feeds into the experience is wonderful in terms of the way that it's presented to you on a visual front.
Yes, and that's a great transition into the visual presentation. I see this as one of the game's strongest suits by far. It is such a unique art style that Hannah Kennedy has done. It's based and designed around the woodcutting and painting styles of this 16th century Bavarian setting. This is, this is not 1-to-1, obviously, but this is very much in the style of this time period. And it works terrifically. I mean, the colors are so vibrant. It has a very characteristic look that no other game really replicates. It's stunning. It's really beautiful.
It's so beautiful. It has this, 2D aesthetic, this feeling, but there's also like dimensionality to the figures. It's like, as you said here, you're talking about the wood cutting and painting styles of the 16th century. It also kind of relays this idea of like a stained glass, glass frame that you're looking at through the mirror, but it's not opaque. Like the characters stand out and they're amongst each other, but it's a beautiful color palette, and it's wistful and charming at its core, and I loved every moment.
There's also a lot of storytelling in the visual representations too. For example, when you see an older character, their colors that they are painted with are fading. And even in some areas, the paint is chipping away entirely, and you see little white splotches that represent, okay, this paint has become so old that it is flaking off. This character is advanced in years. And I think that's a really nice touch. That's so subtle, and they never draw attention to this. It's just something for you to notice.
Yeah.
And I think it's all the better for it. It's just such a beautiful little garnish onto this visual palette. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah, I definitely can agree with you to the front where it's like Hannah is incredibly talented, and I will keep an eye out for her name in whatever work that she's involved with in the future, assuming that she's going to be still with Obsidian or moving on to other teams. But the visual representation of like the entire town is so charming, and as you said, obviously the different characters and the moments that they have whenever you're reading the different text from obviously the different NPCs that you come across. Obviously, as we had discussed before, there's a class stratification that exists in the town of Tassing as well as the Abbey. And you experience obviously the different characters as they relate to you, and the writing is very sharp, it's very witty, but every individual character has different fonts that are written on the paper or written on obviously in the text box that you're reading off of, and the fonts change depending on the way that Andreas Mahler perceives the class of the person that he's speaking to. For example, if he's speaking to the farmer of Gertner's, it's going to be a more simplified humanist style font that's closer to what we would know as like a Times New Roman. Whereas if he's talking to an older, more distinguished aristocrat, or maybe one of the monks that are in a position of authority, you see the Gothic kind of bold in black print colored blocks of the different letters that are in there that are maybe a little bit hard to read for modern audiences. But I just thought that was so cool and such an interesting and just very unique design choice that they went with. Something that I had never seen before in a different game.
That's something that they do highlight in the very beginning of the game. When Andreas is talking to a baron that he perceives at first as being, just some nobleman, doesn't have the education that he has. They're using the peasant script, which is the peasant script is the one that's scrawly, honestly kind of looks like a hybrid of cursive and print. I think it looks really nice, but it signifies the peasants. And when Andreas realizes that the Baron actually does have a pretty high level of education, the font immediately turns transparent and a new font is replaced over it saying the same thing. That
Right.
Times New Roman script that you mentioned that is associated with higher education and learning. That's the only time that the game will call it out, but it happens several times throughout as Andreas starts to perceive people differently. It's that very subtle switch that's flipped in his mind of how he's perceiving somebody's class. Even if it's, whether it's true or not is almost neither here nor there. But it's very subtle, and I really appreciate it.
And it's also kind of an indicator, and this is not spoilers for anybody, but it also is an indicator that may potentially suggest to the player that our protagonist is not as reliable as maybe we would like him to be, which is very interesting. It just obviously with Andreas' characteristic, that's how I interpreted it. But I obviously, you have to look at the game for yourself and see what you think or how you would like to understand Andreas's perspective of the different characters that are in the game, and see, try to find what the truth is for yourself. There's also interesting moments where he's talking to different characters throughout the game and the text bubble appears and, obviously they're typing out, they're scribbling text. The speed of the text that is written changes depending on the level of excitement that the character is portraying, whether it's something that's somebody's reading off of a tome and they're maybe saying a prayer, or if they're, speaking very angrily to Andreas. It depends on how that is written. And there's also several times where if someone is speaking and they make a mistake, there will be a typo that is scratched through and then corrected on the back end. And I love it every time that happens. It always catches my eye, and it's wonderful.
What's cool about that too is, and I forget where I saw this mentioned, but you start to notice that those who are more confident in their writings, like the monks at the scriptorium versus the peasants, those who are more confident tend to make less mistakes and tend to write maybe a little quicker, versus the peasants who aren't as educated, not as used to writing or reading or things of that nature.
Yeah.
So you start to notice that it's very subtle, but it's this characterization in such a how to phrase this. I don't want to keep overusing the word subtle. It is, but it is. It's not upfront that helps characterize these people and in this town. You had mentioned the excitement levels. If somebody is shouting, that you might hear the scribble of the quill.
Yeah.
If they're particularly speaking with virility or hostility or a particularly venomous tongue, you might see ink splatter appear over the text, as if the person writing it couldn't get their quill to the paper fast enough and it just flung ink all over it. It's a really, really nice touch. This game does visual characterization and storytelling in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before in a game.
Yeah, I could agree. I don't think I've ever seen it before either, and I would be surprised. I mean, it's setting precedents for sure when it comes to, the portrayal and how to blend the visual representation with character design and, obviously mechanical design as the player is going throughout the game. Nach dir ist mir so weh, tröst mir mein Gemüte, o puer optime, durch alle deine Güte, o princeps gloriae, trae me poste, trae me poste. Let's talk music real quick. Phenomenal soundtrack. I can't heap enough praise onto this. I really love that they got a contemporary early music group to do the soundtrack, the arranging of the compositions as well, and record this. It's the group called Alchemy. I will link their website in the sources in the description. But they made use of a ton of period-appropriate music from this period, arranging works from Hildegard von Bingen, Heinrich Isaac, Guillaume de Machaut, and also a lot of melodies that just don't have a composer attributed to them, just unknown origin. But it's really spectacular, and the instruments are period appropriate as well.
You hear things like period percussion, recorder consorts, lyres, voice, obviously, with chanting as well as, some vocalization. Viel, Hummelchen. I don't know how to say that. It's a double-reeded small German bagpipe used during the Renaissance. Maybe shawms and crumhorns. I don't know. That's not part of alchemy's consort, but I thought I heard him. I could be wrong. I don't actually know what a Hummelchen sounds like, so it could just be that. And they'll be in genres that are appropriate too. A lot of dances. You'll hear some mass music. Not a lot of mass music. It's really just one of the monks singing. Madrigals, motets, things like that. It's really beautifully well done.
Yeah, it is so well done. I couldn't agree with you more just how it's so interesting kind of to think about the sound design as well as the music, because when I think about Pentiment, I think about the moments in Pentiment. I think about obviously the quill scribbling on ink, or hearing the dissonant sounds of obviously the birds chirping or the insects buzzing in the forest as you're like walking through. Like the sound design is next level in this game, and it does so much to bring the character into that period of time, into that atmosphere. But the music takes that and goes one step further with obviously being period appropriate, and then like on top of it, just like hearing some of the monks sing or hearing some of the vocal tracks that they included in here. It's like I just stopped moving. I just put Andreas on the map and just listened and closed my eyes, and it's, again, as you said, one of the best games that I've played in recent history for 2022 and 23 in terms of what they've done here to kind of blend all of these elements together. Something that I was curious that I wanted to ask you, Rick, obviously with your music background, it was interesting as I was listening to the OST preparing for this episode today. They used a lot of really interesting type signatures, and I really was only able to either parse out 3/3 or 6/6. Did you study any of this type of music when you were working through your program, or is this familiar at all to you?
It's funny you say that, and it's funny that you preface it with my experience, because so when you're applying to graduate schools, in addition to auditioning on whatever instrument you happen to be, saxophone in my case, conducting, dance, whatever, you also have to take entrance exams, and
okay.
In mostly it's going to be history and theory, and music theory for me was always really good. Like I was always really strong at theory. It's a unique blend of rationalization, analytical, and expressiveness, which I think is why I gravitated towards it. But history, not so much. So in both my graduate degrees, my master's and my DMA, I had to take the remedial history course. The first time it was just a general remedial history course, and the second time I passed modern history and I forget if there's a word for the middle period, but a common period maybe. But I had to take a remedial early music history course. And I came out of it, especially through the early music history course. And I should say this is like a standard thing. Like I'm not dumb.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid to admit if I am dumb, but like, a lot of people do. But I came out of that early history course with such a great appreciation of this time period, mainly because I had such a phenomenal professor, who, like a lot of my colleagues and former colleagues, has left the field at this time. But anyway, she's a phenomenally smart scholar and teacher, and I just came away from this period just absolutely loving it. Composers like Palestrina and Gesualdo are some of my favorites from here. We don't really get a lot of that music in this game, but back to your question, did I study it? Yeah, I not as a part of my degree, but just because everybody has to, that you're expected to just have some familiarity with it. Like I probably couldn't define isometric rhythms or isometric motets at this point. I don't think I could tell you what makes an Italian frittata. Jeez. Is that a food versus like a French chanson?
I'm hungry now.
Aside from them being vocal genres, I don't think I could make any meaningful distinctions about them. But at one point, I probably could.
Okay, so it was familiar to you from kind of like a analytical historical perspective, not so much as having touch with like interacting with folks at the music academy, playing, recorder consorts or maybe lyres at all.
No, unfortunately, I never got to do that.
Okay.
I will say, if you're not familiar with this type of music, common practice tonality is something that started to emerge in the Baroque period. This is where we think of your 1-4-5-1 chord progression that's in so many blues, rock, just music everywhere, pop. You hear it all the time. 1-6-2-5, jazz, easy listening, all of that. That started to appear in the Baroque, but this common practice tonality was not a thing in the Renaissance. So they didn't have things like cadences, not as we know them. They didn't think of harmony in terms of tonic, predominant, dominant. It just that linguistically and socially and musically did not exist. So you're going to hear a lot of music that might sound at first meandering, but if you can divorce yourself of that familiarity and lens of modern music, you can start really appreciating the timbres and the melodies that you hear in early music if you're not expecting cadences and things like that. It's and at its core too, a lot of the secular music here, and even that we hear in this game, was meant for dancing. It wasn't meant for just sitting by the fire and listening to it, right? It was meant for social occasions, and you hear a lot of dance music in this game, a whole lot of it.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
It's really terrific. You can find this whole OST on YouTube, all recorded by Alchemy, all arranged by Alchemy. They're an awesome music ensemble. You can read all about them on their website. They've even got kind of like period style portraits. Like it's a color photograph, but they're like posed and kind of dressed-ish in a period way. It's really neat.
Yeah, in the cover art is actually, it's interesting. The Obsidian was able to get a famous artist to act that specializes in this periods type of portraiture to do the cover art of Andreas and all of the different objects that are kind of found throughout the game in the cover art for this music. So yeah, very strongly recommend. Go on Spotify and listen to it right now.
That kind of leads me into the final thoughts section. This game, you had mentioned that they got somebody specializing in that. Josh obviously specializes in this entire period. They worked with artists. They visited museums and special collections that have texts and things from this time period. They even wrote all the Latin in this game, which is astounding.
Incredible.
To me. They wrote it. Like they just did that. This is the best kind of work. It is a work that is motivated entirely by the artist's passions and not, sure, there was probably considerations for money. We can never divorce ourselves from that living in the political climate that we currently live in. We simply cannot. But that notion of for-profit, AAA, sell has been so turned down in the mix that it's almost non-existent. And I think that's why this game, to me, is, that's why I call this a work over a game. I hate that makes me sound so supercilious and pretentious. Sorry, but that's just the best way I can express it. This is a work. It's not just a video game.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that Pentiment, as a piece of work, and obviously as a work of art that it exists and it is today, it's a product of passion, and it's a product of people that have a very strong passion and people who have a very clear vision of what they wanted to do and what they wanted to execute. Rick, you were kind enough to join me, as well as several other people, when it came out on the show. When we talked about Final Fantasy 16, and you had obviously made a very salient point about how that game struggles to cash in the check that it wrote in the beginning of Act 1. And that's one of the things that I think is so special about games like Pentiment is that obviously it's not an indie team. They are a small team that was a subsidiary, a small group that's localized within Obsidian, with a clear leadership at the helm. But it's something that you don't get very often in games, because gaming and the development of games itself is so expansive, and it relies on so many different people and so many different leaders of small cohorts and groups that are on different components of the development team to work together in synchrony. And obviously there's politics that come into play there. There's bureaucracy that comes into play there. So there's a lot of things that happen in game development that causes pieces like Final Fantasy 16 to get muddled in the works, to lose sight of the original objective. And I think that one of the most amazing things about Pentiment is that from start to finish, it never loses sight of what it's trying to do or what it is to the player. And I just think that that is so beautiful. And the fact that, I'm going to be the first person to sit here and say, none of these gigantic mega corporations like Sony and Microsoft are ever going to be your friends. But I will say that good on the people who are in charge of, overseeing this project to say, hey, yeah, we'll write the check for the team to go ahead and put together this game, because it is a miracle that it got made. Again, I'm reiterating that point just because it's you don't see that many of these outside of the indie space these days. And I just really hope that we get more of that. It touched me emotionally, and it touched me in a way that it's difficult to describe as a whole. So I hope that relays kind of to the listener why I think this is so special, and I hope that this is enough to convince them to download it on their end.
Well, there's nothing that I could say that would add anything more enriching than what you just did, so I think we'll leave it at that. Well said. Before we dive into the story, we're going to use our community forum to get us there. If you want to join the community forum and give your thoughts on the games that we play, join the Discord. It's free and it's always appreciated. You can find links to that in the episode description. We've only got one today. I was kind of expecting that. I don't really think a lot of the community has played this, and it comes from Dave Jackson. So Dave, take us into the story. Here's what Dave has to say. Pentiment's art, murder mystery plot, and developer pedigree were the draws, but I didn't know it would be so steeped in its historical setting, or that it would be telling such a great story. Its themes of faith, loss, and how history is decided really resonated with me, and I greatly enjoyed seeing how time moved forward in Tassing. Also, tons of great artwork like the Ship of Fools and all the fucked up little animals. It's one of my favorite games of 2022, and it's the kind of game that I hope to see more of. Passion projects from otherwise large studios. Yep, I think Nick said it and Dave said it so well that I'm simply not going to muddy their waters. So let's dive into historical Bavaria, into the town of Tassing and Kearsaw Abbey, and let's hear all about Andreas Mahler's escapades in Pentiment. Okay, so up top, let's just set clear expectations. For part one, for today's episode, we are going to cover Act 1 in its entirety and probably the first 2/3 of Act 2. That leaves part 2 as having the last third of Act 2 and all of Act 3, as well as some ending discussions. So let's get into it. The introduction of this, I think you alluded to this earlier, Nick, is really nice, and it kind of highlights in an abstract way, well, not super abstract upon recollection, but it highlights, without being too on the nose, some of the themes of this game. There is a page of Latin, and whoever is sitting at this workspace takes a stone and begins to erase text, as if we're starting anew. What are we erasing, and what are we beginning? Are we erasing the past? Are we starting anew? Are we going to see any of that Latin come back? We don't know.
Exactly, yeah, and it's something that is beautiful. It's one of those moments where you're like, okay, we're gonna start here, and it's it's interesting because as playing through this game, I started thinking back about like what this introduction meant. Like what are we actually erasing here, and why are we starting again, and what does that actually mean to us? And it takes us in.
The first thing that we see here is a dream sequence. We're in a recurring area of Andreas's subconscious while he's dreaming. It's referred to as the memory palace. And Andreas is going to be talking to a few figures throughout here. We've got Saint Grobian, who is the patron saint of vulgar and coarse people. We've got Socrates, obviously probably the most well-known philosopher of all time. Prester John, who's a legendary Christian patriarch, and Beatrice. This is the only one that's not readily Googleable, but from what I've seen, I think it might be a reference to Beatrice from Dante's Divine Comedy. But these people that you're speaking with in your mind, in your dreams, I should say, and sometimes your mind, represent the different personas that Andreas has, right? Don't worry, this isn't a JRPG. We're not going into Jung and Nietzschean theory, nothing like that.
We can.
We maybe. There are choices in here, that's all I'm saying. But these sort of represent Andreas's different personality traits, right? And you have agency as to when you let these out. Beatrice represents compassion and prudence. Grobian is a little trickster that always he speaks coarsely and ends almost every sentence with heh kind of like Beavis and Butthead. Socrates is very pragmatic. I know that I know nothing. And Prester John, being a Christian patriarch, is devoted to Christ and keeping the heart pure and the soul pure. We sort of get to touch base with each of these. Sometimes you'll get to have a little internal dialogue and you can choose which of these resonates with you. It doesn't really impact the game, and many of this game's choices don't. This game is interesting insofar as it subtly subverts what the player is expecting when it comes to a choice-based role-playing game. It becomes very clear once we get to Act 2 that Andreas is a character, and while we have some agency in how his character is expressed, we do not get to dictate his story. This isn't Fallout New Vegas.
Yeah. BioWare and Bethesda have kind of trained us to understand, or at least to expect while we're playing through RPGs or narrative-based, choice-based RPGs, that, one decision, cause equals effect. One decision is going to impact the other. And I think that it was a very specific point of the team when making this game, is that they wanted, as you said, Andreas to be a character. He's not an avatar for the player. And I appreciate that, because I don't really... I understand the usefulness of it, but I don't really care for tabula rasa protagonists. I don't care for blank slate protagonists where you're just emulating whatever the players want to be. I get it's purposeful in some cases. In this case, it's not, because they had a very clear story they wanted to tell, a very well thought out and organized narrative that they wanted to convey throughout this game. And I think that it was very important that they gave Andreas the agency that was reflected through, obviously, as you said before, the different imaginary, personalities that you see through Saint Grobian or Socrates, or whether it's Beatrice, as you go throughout the game, and you kind of make those decisions with him. But they don't lead to an effect. Like they not only do they not lead to an effect, you also are kind of like left to wonder, like, what did I do wrong? Like, why did things turn out this way throughout several points of the game? And this is kind of it leads into it up front, and you understand that it's very, very loose.
I'm glad that you mentioned that that you like this sort of setup. The older that I get, the more I am prone to play games that are focused and linear, that tell the story that they're wanting to tell, and I'm just less interested in games that, you could do a million things and just answer, whatever way you want, and it's make your own adventure. I think those are really fun sometimes, but I am so much more interested in just a focused narrative these days, and I'm glad I'm not the first to express this. I'm glad that linearity is not like the bad word in the gaming space that it used to be.
I agree with you. I have limited time. Increasingly, as we do get older, I have limited time to play the games that I want. And so I've not only have to be a little bit more selective about what I play. I can't play every 120 hour, CRPG or JRPG that comes across my desk. But this is something that it is a credit to Pentiment as a whole. It is, you're looking at maybe a 20 some odd, 23, 25 hour experience that is told very directly. And the characters have a lot of real, like they wrote these characters to be very realistic individuals. Like they're very authentically told in terms of how they're relayed. And it's in that begins with Andreas and then expands out from him to the other characters that are within the town and the abbey.
I think it's a little shorter than that. I've got 2 full playthroughs, my current playthrough, which I'm about halfway done with, and then another abandoned playthrough up to part 3, and I've got 42 hours on Steam.
Oh, interesting.
As of right now.
Gotcha.
So I think it's, and I don't think I played it on PlayStation. I don't think so. Anyway,
you're a quick reader, Rick.
Maybe. So we're getting introduced to Andreas now. He is, as we mentioned, he's an artist who is lodging with the Gertner family. He's working at the local scriptorium and working on his masterpiece before he returns back to Nuremberg to become a master. That's the title of master is earned in this way. And also to marry. More on that later. The Gertners, we've got Clara and Peter who are married. Old Peter, he's called Ill Peter, but I think at one point I refer to him as Ill, so I'm just calling him Old Peter. And then also their daughter Ava, as well as Big Jorg and Ursula. Ursula's a little baby. This game does babies really well.
Yeah,
did you notice that?
I did. They're people. They're human beings, much like actual babies are.
Andreas will go up to her and be like, "Oh, hello, Ursula," and her dialogue box will go, "Onderb." It's like, yes, that's probably what she would have said.
Exactly. It's really fascinating. I'm at a very special point in my life, being an uncle to my co-host William's daughter, who just turned 1 back in February. So it's very salient that what you said, that they do babies and they do toddlers in this game very, very well, because of the children. They're usually just little rapscallions, little rascals that are in this game. But yeah, they're they're affectionate and they're sweet, and it's very, very accurate.
Speaking of people in this game, there are a lot of townsfolk, and rather than just list them all out right now, which I think would be kind of boring, just trust as the listener that these people all exist in the town, and as they're relevant, we'll bring them up. So they might not come up for a while, and you might hear about somebody, at the very end of this episode, beginning of next episode. Just trust that they're there. I don't think either of us really want to just play the list game. So as we're going up to the Abbey to work on our scriptorium, we get to flesh out our character through conversations, natural conversations with Clara, with I think Big Jorg as well, about our background in our life. And we actually, you get quite a few choices here. So there are 3 tiers of this. You've got your foundational strengths with your hobbies. I'm reading off of a Screen Rant list because I forgot to take notes, so I just plagiarized their title. Please forgive me. Your hobbies can include hedonist, craftsman, bookworm, rapscallion, and businessman. All of these are going to serve as flavor text throughout the game, including the ones that I'm about to mention next. They kind of flesh out Andreas's past, how he interacts with the world, things like that. This playthrough, I chose Bookworm.
Mm-hmm.
I love them books.
Yeah, and it makes sense because of where he is in the scriptorium. I decided to go with Craftsman in this situation just because obviously he is an artist. He's trying to further his art, and he has a very deep understanding of different pieces in artwork and how that is related. And I think that's also it almost goes hand in hand with being a bookworm in this game, because obviously he's working in a scriptorium and creating the pictures that are within these books, creating the portraits, or I don't know if you would call them murals, but they were just with the portraiture that is inside the text, which if you go and this is real stuff. You can go to Italy, today and see it, and you see in a museum some of the most beautiful pieces of work that were placed inside of these books at that point in time, because scripture was considered an art form. It's incredible.
That it is, yeah. You have two more choices to make here, technically three. You get to choose your background. You can choose either theology, imperial law, or medicine. By the way, this choice in particular, as well as the next choice, will open you up to being able to read different languages that you might otherwise not be able to read, have knowledge of things, and make sense of clues you find that you otherwise might not be able to. So it's not all flavor. Some of it is practical. But in this one, my playthrough, I chose imperial law. So I was very knowledgeable of the law and often could pipe up and say, actually, the law works this way, and that nobody ever likes that.
Everybody hates it. Everybody hates it. It's my favorite thing. Every time he says something, they're like, "Shut up, nerd!" And it's like, it's great.
Basically, it's like what it reminds me of like when Mac and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is talking about science is dumb sometimes. Big science, bitch. You know,
science is a liar sometimes.
Oh boy.
Yeah. That's great.
So good. Which of these did you pick?
I did the same thing. I went with imperial law. If I were to go through another playthrough, which I may well after this, if I can make time for it, I might go with theology, just because you're surrounded by biblical texts throughout this, and this might give you more of a key understanding. And again, Rick had mentioned this impacts or influences the way that the way that you set up Andreas, the way that you build his background, influences like dialogue choices that he has access to, as well as his ability to decipher different clues that are presented to him throughout the course of the mystery.
Theology is fun. I've done a playthrough before where I was theology educated and also interested in the occult, which is very fun.
That's great. That sounds awesome.
Speaking of, you get to choose two of your final preferences and subjects. Those are Latinist, logician, orator, occultist, and heavens and earth, things like animals and plants. This time I chose Latinist and orator, so I was acting as Socrates, just going around and debating everybody. There was actually one point in the game where I was able to join a conversation that was entirely in Latin, which I otherwise would not have been able to do. So that was fun. Do you remember what you chose here?
Yeah, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe I went with logician and heavens and earth when I chose these final two studies of interest for Andreas. And it is a little hazy in terms of how that specifically affects him, but I know that in terms of a logician, you're able to speak with a little bit more knowledgeable understanding of business, or in terms of how different you can logically kind of do your deductions as you're going throughout the world and unraveling the story that's in here. And then I do specifically remember that heavens and earth, it gives you a little ping every time you can either stumble upon a dialogue option, or if whatever you're talking about comes up and is relevant to that piece of background. But it often will be like if he's looking at a flower, or if he's looking at a specific animal inside of a book, his knowledge of like heavens and earth will come up and give you a little bit more context or flavor text to what you're experiencing at that point in time.
Yes, you could do that with any of these. It's very cool. It's very fun. So on our way up to the Abbey to get to work at the scriptorium, we run into the Baron, Lorenz Rothvogel. He's come to town a little bit earlier than expected to check on this commission that he's done. The early arrival kind of stresses out the monks, particularly Father Gernot. As we speak to him on our way up, we realize he's highly educated. This is where we get the first font change, I'm pretty sure. We also get to pick some more of our background here, but we just covered that. So the Baron in particular is really interested in Martin Luther's theses, as well as this book that he's brought containing Tassing's history. The previous prior Matthew, I think, Matthias, was very, very open, to reading books, and very open to the townsfolk practicing pagan rituals and rites. The new Prior Ferenc, is not so much. And the Baron has brought this book called Historia Tassing that details how this town was formed. And that's, believe it or not, going to be a crucial part of the upcoming story. One other thing about the Baron to note is we see that a lot of the locals don't like him. We see him arguing with one of the locals. An old woman curses his name. Even the nuns turn away whenever he comes up here. So that's just, I'll keep that in the back of your mind. That's going to be important very soon. So we get to the Abbey. We get introduced to the brothers there, Brother Guy, Brother Adoc, and Brother Piero. Piero is the old, kind man who's kind of your mentor.
Yeah.
Brother Guy and Adoc are always sort of at each other's throats. Guy is kind of an asshole, and Adoc is just like too old for his shit. And Piero is the one that's trying to calm the waters anytime they're at each other's throats.
Which is quite often, if you're led to believe, in that scriptorium, because they're all just next to each other all day, just mad at each other. It's great.
Yes, absolutely. Piero has a really nice line here. He'll view Andreas's masterpiece, and one of his critiques of it is, this is a fine interpretation of someone else's work. And I took that line down because as somebody that has been creating all of my adult life, that really strikes me, and that's something that I think about all the time, especially on this show. I really try to not make this an imitation of just every other podcast out there, and that's a little difficult, I think, with video game podcasts especially. The term video game book club gets thrown around all the time. There's a format for it that's not really quite how book clubs work, but they call them that. And I don't know. This line stuck out to me a lot. I really like it, and I try to strive not to be that, but do any of us ever succeed in that area? I can't say. Originality
is so hard. I mean, I commiserate with you as well on that front. Obviously I don't want to. I'm guilty on all accounts of taking the best pieces of other different podcasts to incorporate and layer into what we try to do over at the Friday Night Gamecast with our own unique spin and our own unique perspective on things. But this line from him is very important. This is one of the first ones that stood out to me as well when I was playing, because it's very important. Like, you get this sense from Andreas that he's very intent on trying to become a master as quickly as possible. Like, he's trying to be as good as the masters that he's portraying or what he's trying to emulate in this work. And Piero kind of sees right through him, but it's not necessarily in a way that is in condemnation. He's more of he's definitely taking more of a guiding hand to Andreas, and this is the interaction where you see that they're actually quite close to each other throughout the time that he spent there.
Yeah, they're very close. Which, if you're genre savvy, you can probably smell where that's going.
Yep.
After this, it is time for a meal, which that's something that we didn't mention in visuals. Time is tracked here using the divine office. These are the hours of prayer that the church would adhere to. Hours such as Compline, Vespers, Terce, Matins, various others that I don't know off the top of my head. It's tracked that way, and it's represented by a spinning wheel that's represented like a pie graph, a pie chart, basically. And right now, it's mealtime. So meals, believe it or not, are a big part of this game, and it's how you learn a lot about the town, the townsfolk, and get information, which means... Well, let me back up for a second. With the exception of this time, and I think the next meal, you can generally choose who you eat with, and you're never going to be able to do all of them on one playthrough. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we'll cover what we can, but it's just functionally we're not able to do all of that on one playthrough. So we might miss some of your favorite meal scenes if we didn't see them.
Yeah, and I will say that... in terms of like we had spent a good amount of time talking about the visual presentation, but the meal times are one of the most unique and one of the most aesthetically pleasing, soothing ASMR moments. Obviously, not only just the depiction of the food that you are presented with at whatever various table that you're occupying at any given time, but just the sound of Andres eating the food. And it's not gross. It sounds like, he's chewing into the microphone. That's not what it is. It's just they do these subtle things like the crunch of bread, or kind of just dipping your spoon into a bowl of pea porridge or whatever it may be.
Pottage. Yeah, a lot of pottage in this game.
So much pottage and cheese and sausages. It makes me very hungry, and I'm very mad every time I play it because I don't have any of this food at my disposal.
Yeah, and the townsfolk with less means are going to have less interesting food to eat, whereas the prior or the miller, Lenhart, they have more money, and they have venison and wine even. So
exactly.
That's fun. This particular meal we're eating with, oh gosh, I can't remember, Klaus and I think Andres? I'm not quite sure. But you learn that the Baron... Oh, Otto and Andres. That's right.
Yeah.
They tell you learn from them that the last time the Baron was in town, he beat up Old Man Ranning. That's the widow Ottilia's late husband. And this is where the whiffs of the class resentment from the townsfolk toward Andreas start to come into play, where they're like, man, you don't really get it. Like you wouldn't understand what we're going through, city boy.
Yeah, and he's left out of a lot. He's like left in the dark in multiple moments because of this very situation. And they're like, you haven't lived amongst us, then you haven't experienced what we've experienced a lot of the times. And that comes into play a lot later on when he's trying to get information out of some of these folks.
Oh, yeah. After this meal, we go back to the scriptorium to do some more work. Prior Ferenc is overseeing all of the brothers, and he's very on edge because of the Baron's early arrival. Piero, who is old and a bit slower, was in charge of his commission, and it's nowhere near done. That's making everybody on edge. The Baron comes, he's very disappointed with the progress, or the lack of progress, and he starts flaunting his wealth and status to basically get what he wants. Andreas is going to take over the commission. Piero is more than happy. He's, Guy and Adok are fighting. Guy is hurling insults. Adok is saying, Lord, give me strength to deal with this man, things like that. Piero is happy to give it to Andreas. He's like, look, it's fine. I'm old. It's no big deal. The Baron also basically forces Andreas an invite to dinner with him and the brothers, the prior and the brothers.
Right.
Which is generally not something that happens. Even Prior Ferenc is like, that would be unusual, but if you want it, then of course, please keep giving us money, please.
Yeah, something that's an interesting note that kind of is something that's also directly portrayed in The Name of the Rose is that scriptoriums at this point in time, during leading up to the point of the Great Reformation, they're going out of business. And this is something that you see portrayed throughout as one of the main families that are in the game. We have a bookmaker, a printing press family. These were when they were just created, and so printing presses, they were able to create books at an astonishingly quicker rate than it takes for a priest to pen or practice their calligraphy across hundreds of pages. Being able to pump 100 books in a day when it would take a group of monks in a scriptorium to do 10 books in a month. At best, right? Like that's with a full-fledged staff. It's very kind of salient and important to note that the Abbey is experiencing economic hardship at this time, and it's because of and that's another reason why they are so willing to kind of be very pliant and be very subservient to the Baron who comes into town, because they're like, hey, we really need his money. Like we're running out of funds. We're running out of reasons to continue existing in the scriptorium at this time.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. I neglected to do so. Yeah, the scriptorium is, not that far off from being an anachronism.
Yeah.
We'll see how that progresses. At the evening that night, the Baron tries to debate about Martin Luther's 95 Theses. Nobody likes that. Everybody gets upset, and eventually he gets kicked out. If you decide to side with him, which I did because I took the debater route, the Prior Ferenc and Father Gounod get very upset with you.
Yeah.
But that, you both get asked to leave. On the way home, you hear some shrieking from this church room. Somebody is yelling, "The Pale Horse, Matan's death." This is Amelie. She is a sister who has a, quote, physical and spiritual pain and deformities, according to her caretaker, who just happens to be walking by, Father Thomas. He explains that she sees visions from God, and because Andreas has a lick of reason, he's like, she's shouting about death. Is everything, is someone in danger? And Father Thomas says, no, God works in mysterious ways. So he's like, just don't worry about it, bro.
Don't worry.
Something that we didn't mention at the very beginning, when you're navigating around town, someone's flock of sheep got out, and it's blocking off various avenues around town. This next morning, it's flooding down at the Gertner farm and everywhere in town. And this flooding, in combination with that sheep escape, sort of give us a tutorial around town. It forces us to explore and take all the different routes so you get the lay of the land, so to speak.
Yeah, this is where I sorry, you kind of like you jump in and you're getting more of a sense of how the town is laid out. And from a mechanical and like gameplay perspective, that's quite nice. They're taking you very quickly through almost all of the areas that you're going to be retreading. And then of course, as the game moves on, you're slowly given access to new areas. There are different trees within the main map kind of open up, but this back and forth, coming from the Abbey to the Gertner farm, at this point in time, does a good job of kind of giving the player a solid understanding of where they're going to be and who they're going to be interacting with.
Right. On the way to the scriptorium, you can talk to the Baron's servant, if you want. You'll learn that the Baron hasn't come back from his morning hike yet, and that Martin, a local shitbag from around town, a known thief, was seen running away, and he stole some rings, some gulden, and that book, the Historia Taciae.
Is this the moment where he's like, Andreas is walking back to the Abbey to go to the house to go speak with the Baron, and like Martin runs up and like kicks his shin and says, "Eat shit," and like runs away? Is that what it was?
Yeah, if Martin doesn't like you, if he does like you, he says something like, "I'll give you half whenever I get back," or something like that.
Interesting.
But yes, that is that scene.
Okay, got it.
Whenever you get to the scriptorium, you do some work for a little bit, and Brother Matthew begins ringing the church bell to summon everyone to the chapter house. And when you get there, we find the Baron in cold blood, murdered, and Piero is seemingly caught red-handed in flagrante delicto, holding a knife. Everybody's freaking out. Nobody knows what's going on. Father Gurnot detains Piero in the basement until we can figure out what's going on. He's really pissed that we're arguing that Piero didn't do this. Essentially what's going on is Gurnot is really worried about this drawing attention to the Abbey. It could get them shut down. And specifically, he's worried about the Prince Bishop of Freising, a ruler of the lands in this area, including Tassing.
Yeah, something that's a little bit of a historical note for a lot of our listeners to kind of understand is that at this point in time, there's no such thing as police. Policing and like a police system is a very new, very modern understanding of like obviously modern society. There were probably what we would kind of understand as like lawmen or justicars that would be traveling nomadic people who were well versed and trained in the law. But at this point in time, there really was nobody designated in any given society that was responsible for shutting people down for doing something wrong or obviously investigating a death, investigating a murder, if you will.
That's right. Yeah, police, detectives, not a thing back here. And that's practically going to factor into this. They're all worried about this, so they want answers. Like they want to know who did it. They're not going to be conducting the most in-depth investigations.
Yeah.
Andreas kind of takes it upon himself because he wants to protect Piero, right? Because as of now, Piero is going to be put to death for this.
Yes.
And you step in and say, no. I can prove that this wasn't Piero. Even just looking at it, players can know, like, Piero is so old, there's no way he would have done this. This is what I meant earlier when I said genre-savvy players like yourself probably saw this coming.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where it's like as you said, there's no way that he would have been able to overpower this, clearly very, just able-bodied grown man that the Baron was at that point in time. So it was really, really curious and unfortunate. You understand kind of the perspective of where Gernot is coming from, because getting the local ruler involved not only meant getting shut down, there was probably a high probability that other people besides Piero would have been put to the sword if there was an authority figure that was coming in for a massive amount of judgment.
Well, that's something too that this game hones in on. It hones in on that desire that I think most humans have of, when they're put in situations like this, whether we like to admit it or not, there's always something in our brains that just wants an answer. And at a certain point, whether it's driven by fear or driven by boredom in some cases, we want it to be over. And at some point it's just like, okay, just finger someone and let's just go. Let's get this over with. And that's what some of the people here are thinking. They're like, we just want to know who did it.
Yeah.
And if you say it was this person, okay, well, God save them, off with their head. It's tapping into that. And, it's not quite mob mentality. I don't want to say that, but it is, it's one of the darker sides of I think, the human brain and the human, what would you even call this? Like a anthropology sort of bent to it. I don't know. I don't really know the proper words for this, to how to express what I'm thinking, but it taps into that idea, and it's very interesting, and we'll come to find that answers aren't as clear cut as we would hope them to be.
Right. Exactly.
So this is where the mystery of the game begins. We get some degree of freedom in terms of what we're able to do. Our days are going to progress like this. We are going to have time in the morning to search for evidence. Generally, the evidence that gives you the strongest evidence is going to require time to pass, whether that's participating in an activity, helping someone with something, whatever. Then you'll have a meal. Then you'll get to do evidence searching again, another meal, and then you go to bed. What's funny, too, is I just want to say this here because I don't know where else to say it. Everyone throughout this investigation, like, you are not seen as some do-gooder. You are seen as somebody that's sticking his nose into where it doesn't belong. You're getting involved in townsfolk business. You're a city boy. You don't get it. You're nebby, as Pittsburghers would say. They want you to mind your own business, particularly the people that you think did it.
Yeah. It's so fascinating when you start getting into it, and you're already met with like this kind of staunch response whenever you kind of begin the process of trying to jump into the investigation. And it's so true, though. I mean, realistically, it's true. I mean, the alternative, or like Andres has put it in an impossible situation. The alternative is that, this very kind old man who was a mentor to him, who was somebody that is incredibly important to him, that is 100% innocent, would be killed. If they just went along with whatever the abbot wanted to do, he would be immediately put to death. But he also has no real place, and it's surprising to me to kind of understand now, he doesn't really have a good understanding of the complexities of the relationships that exist within the town of Tassing. So it's very interesting as you kind of go throughout this process of collecting evidence and having these conversations and these meals with the various folks that are within the town, and kind of understanding, you know absolutely nothing until you kind of are able to pull the loose threads that start presenting themselves slowly over time.
Absolutely. Let's talk about this investigation. So, in my notes, what I have here, I have the three main suspects, the people with probable cause. That would be Prior Ferenc, Lucky the stonemason, and Otilia the widow. And I also have miscellaneous areas. Oh, also the nuns, but nobody's accusing the nuns. And then miscellaneous information, as well as meals. And I've numbered everything here in the order that I've done it. So rather than going through list style and me saying, here's what I did, what did you do? And then you saying, this is what I did, what about you? Rather than doing that, I don't think that would be super interesting to the listeners. I'm trying to walk a very fine line on this show. And this is something with the restarting of the podcast that we've done now that I've taken a little hiatus. I'm trying to be better about this. On one hand, I want to go through these games and talk about them beat by beat, both for people who haven't played the game, if they just want to have the experience and they have no interest, as well as people who have played the game and want a second or third go through. I very firmly believe that most art can reveal new information or new discoveries upon rereading, re-listening, things like that. You learn something new every time you listen to a work by Beethoven, every time you read your favorite novel. So on one hand, I do want to detail the game, but on the other hand, I don't want to devote too much time to plot summary. I want to keep the analysis and the discussion as the forefront. and that's a very tight rope, and I don't feel like I've ever quite got the right balance. But I think I'm trending in the right direction now that we're restarting the show, so to speak. So, all that being said, rather than list out everything, we're just going to talk about the evidence gathering and the investigation as a whole. We'll go into who is accused and why. I've got all of these accused in my playthroughs, and we'll talk about particular meals that we had, if any of them come up as being interesting. But I just wanted to preface with that. We're not going to go evidence meal, sleep, evidence meal, sleep. Okay. Whew, we got through it. So let's talk about the evidence. So right up front, was there anybody that you were suspecting on your first playthrough?
Yeah, Prior Ferenc is, in my first playthrough, obviously the game is, he was the most suspicious to me. He was the most kind of suspect character at my front, and then obviously as you kind of learn as to why he is this way, or what is causing him to act so suspiciously, he's where I lean towards going up front. As you said before, like, I'm not gonna take the time to accuse the nuns that, really I just don't see any viable merit in them having actually perpetrated the murder. Not to mention the fact that they're just fucking nuns. So forgive my language on that front, but yeah, it's God
forgive you.
God forgive me, please. It's one of those where with Ferenc, he's kind of an asshole up front. He's not really a wonderful administrator or kind of curator of the scriptorium as it is up front, and he's implementing new rules. And on top of that, he's hiding things. He's blatantly hiding things. Like, you're sitting in the room as Andreas and you're working. There's like a moment where you go back to the scriptorium and you're continuing to try to work because you have these quotas to fill, right? And you see Ferenc at one point just come in and like he's acting shifty. His eyes are darting around the room as if nobody's watching what he's doing. Obviously, the player can see what he's doing. And then he like takes a book and like slams it shut and runs away. This is something that is almost one for one of what I of course my first playthrough hadn't seen The Name of the Rose yet, but it's also portrayed through different characters in the moment that William of Baskerville and Adzo were walking through the scriptorium in that film, and it kind of there's very similar analogs of what happens there. So I was like, Ferenc, I have to investigate you further.
Yeah, Ferenc is very suspicious. He's very upset at the Baron's arrival, which he does say is because of the commission being unfinished, which is plausible. But what you learn through looking in his stuff to see what he was hastily hiding, like you just mentioned, you learn that the Baron was blackmailing Ferenc into performing an occult ritual. I can't remember if he was just looking into it, had knowledge, had interest or what, but he does have knowledge of the occult, and the Baron was blackmailing him, you learn through a letter that you find, as well as this cipher that Ferenc uses to like encrypt his writings. Yeah. You learn that he was being blackmailed into doing this, and Ferenc didn't want to do it, but he was going to go through with it because the Baron, has money and power. Somebody else, if you talk to them, I think it's Smokey and the town gossip and charcoal burner. Yeah. I think you learn through him that he saw Ferenc in the woods doing a blood ritual, like cutting his hand and draining blood into a goblet. Yep. Ferenc is very suspicious.
Yeah, and it's a little unclear as to why he's being directed to do these things. I'm trying to think back, as obviously, but he has access. He has enhanced access to the abbey more so than the rest of the monks. He obviously has access to the library, which leads through different parts of the town. And for me, looking at him, and obviously, the fraught relationship that was existing between him and the Baron at this point in time, I was like, a lot of things are kind of pointing towards this being you're responsible for this situation.
So this playthrough, I went after Lucky, the stonemason. Yeah. What you learn, Lucky was arguing with the Baron whenever he first came to town. And what you learn is that in the past, the Baron hooked up with one of Lucky's children, and she got pregnant. he deserted her. And since Lucky's wife is the town midwife, Agnes, their daughter tried to use her childbirth medicine to sort of do a proto-abortion on the fetus. And so I was unclear on this. It either didn't work and then she committed suicide, or it didn't work and because of that she died. I was a little unclear on that.
I
can't remember.
Yeah, I interpreted it as she died because of complications of the medicine not being wholly successful. And it ended up killing both her and the child, and that's why you see their gravestones later on towards the salt mines, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, you. If you ask Lucky about this, he flatly he basically tells you to fuck off without saying that.
Yep.
He well, actually, this is something we didn't talk about before with the script. He takes the Lord's name in vain with you a lot, like "God damn it, Andreas," blah 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 blah. Anytime the characters write God, Christ, His, Lord, it's always written in red ink.
Yes.
And it's always written last because they would have to switch the quills, which is just chef's kiss. That's such a great touch.
Do they also do that for he, him when it's in reference to God as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. If you follow Lucky around, you'll see him praying at the grave, like you just said. And on the grave, it says "to innocents." And we see another note, or we see a note in purple. These notes are going to pop up all throughout the investigations. They're written in very elaborate script in German and in handwriting that is so fine that the brothers at the Abbey just can't match it. And this one here with Lucky says, "Remember the girl, one grave for two innocents, the red bird flies, Matins, chapter," which is pretty close to one that we found in the Baron's jacket, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is where the idea of the thread puller first comes into play. Somebody was trying to lure somebody to the chapter house to murder the Baron.
Yeah, you quickly realize there are machinations at play that are larger than just the main murder at hand that you're trying to unravel.
Yeah, somebody is playing a strategy game with these people. Do you want to hear something funny?
Yeah.
Is in my first playthrough, I got to the end, I wasn't sure who did it, and at the time I was like, well, I think it's got to be Ottilia.
Really?
It couldn't have been Piero. Piero's too old. It had to have been the widow. I went after her. Her, she's the reason that I pegged her is because when she learns that he's dead, she says, "Good. I hope he burns in hell. If there is a hell, I hope he burns." Perchta, the goddess of the hunt, may she hunt him down for all eternity. And she says this to anybody who will talk to her. Because, like we mentioned before, on the Baron's last visit into town, he beat the shit out of the Baron, who then could never recover and died shortly thereafter.
He beat Attilia's husband, right?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
That was my mistake.
Yeah, he does. He's a bad guy, and I'm assuming, and I'm not. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that Attilia's husband attacked the Baron because word got out that he impregnated Lucky's daughter, right?
That's maybe.
Or is that
that's certainly plausible.
Loose? Okay. I wasn't sure if there was like a reason for him being attacked by the Baron.
I actually did not pursue anything about Ottilia this time around, so I do not remember. But that's as good of a reason as any.
Yeah.
Martin at one point is considered a suspect, but since he fled town, eventually nobody takes him seriously. Like, he's dismissed. You can also talk to the nuns too, and what you can learn there is that one of the nuns received a letter too that said, "Remember what he did, the violence you suffered, the red bird flies, Matins chapter." And what you learn if you speak to Mother Cecilia is that on one of his previous visits, he, quote, caused irreparable harm to one of the other sisters. So you can learn that this is documented in the library's notes, which, she doesn't give you access to. You can say, "But I know all about the secret entrance." And she says, "Please just don't."
Yeah.
And,
right.
But, the time Baron was in town, he sexually assaulted one of the sisters, and it was so traumatic that she had to leave the monastery for a while and then come back.
Yeah. Bad dude. Deserved what he got.
Did you examine the body when Brother Florian gave you the opportunity?
I did. I was very interested as to what this was going to be like. And I was like, for any good murder mystery, you have to do a good, God, what do they call that?
Autopsy.
Autopsy, exactly.
Yeah. So if you don't do this, Florian will just send you a letter saying like, oh, I really thought that you would be there, but he just sort of explains what he finds. There are two important things that we learn. One is that the stab wound was likely self-inflicted. When the Baron fell, he probably fell onto his dagger that he took out to defend himself. And two, the cause of death was actually blunt force trauma to the head. Somebody cracked him in the head so hard that his skull fractured.
So the stab wound and the blood all over the place was kind of a red herring, and obviously you see Piero holding the knife, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe his hands were just bloody when we're stumbling on the scene. Yeah,
he's holding the knife.
Yeah, he's holding the knife. So obviously there's, again, it goes back to this idea of there are machinations at play, that, the more is afoot, Watson. And so that you're kind of led to understand that. And I remember doing that. An interesting note on the brother, his brother Florian, who was the one that was responsible. He has an understanding of medical knowledge in order to perform this because he was a former soldier in the army. And I think it was...
Yeah, he's got an eye patch.
Yeah, he's got an eye patch, and he had served in some previous war in the past. I wasn't sure if it was in Italy or somewhere else in Germany at that time, but it was... he has medical knowledge from acting as a medic in the army, and that's why he was kind of designated default as the de facto medical examiner.
Mm-hmm. So those folks all have probable cause. Ottilia, Lucky, and Prior Ferenc. Did you have any meals that you wanted to talk about that you did that you thought were just funny or good or gave you good information?
It's tough because of the amount of time that it's been since the point in time I've been at that point in the game. But I do remember that I did actually have the meal with the Gertners. I believe I remember being so kind of like stressed out about it that I was familiar with the Gertners, and I went back to them. And then I also went to the Druckers' house, and the Druckers kind of are very friendly towards Andreas. They're not as cold as some of the other families are. Like they're definitely quick to remind Andreas of his place in their town, but they at the same time, I think that the Druckers are also very warm and receptive to his presence as another man of knowledge.
Yeah, Klaus Drucker is going to be good friends with Andreas. That comes back in the next act. I had a meal with Smokey and Václav. Smokey lives out in the woods. He's kind of a hermit, and Václav is a Romani person that came into town. He's staying with Smokey. Smokey is also a gossip, so he'll tell you. It's really funny. He offers to trade stories, and every time he asks, you're like, "Well, I don't have anything," and he's like, "Oh, okay. Check this out," and he'll just talk until you stop him.
Yeah,
you can learn a lot from him. That's from him is where you learn Brother Václav and Sister Matilda come to the woods to get freaky.
Yeah,
and,
that's right.
That becomes a thing. Let's see. I had lunch with Johann, Hetty, Veronica, and Hans, which was fun. Hetty is apparently a drunk, and it comes through during the meal.
Now, who are these characters? Now, what was their role in the town? I'm trying to remember their...
I can't remember what Johann does.
Okay.
Veronica and Hans are brother and sister. Veronica's the one in the blue that marries Big Jorg in Act 2.
Okay.
With that one, it's largely about increased taxes. That's what the majority of these meals are going to be centered around.
Yes.
Local politics. Like the Abbey keeps raising taxes because they're running out of money, and nobody can afford to live anymore, barely afford to eat, and it's tensions are brewing. That's what a lot of these center around.
Yeah.
But with this meal in particular, you get kicked out because Veronica and Hans keep bickering.
Yeah, I remember. I feel like I might have a vague memory of that. It is interesting, and also to your point about the stress between the Abbey increasing taxes to further subsidize like the lifestyle of and of course, at this point in time, monks are supposed to live a life of poverty, but they aren't necessarily doing that. I mean, they do have a certain lifestyle that's present and existent at the Abbey at this time, and they're eating well enough for some of them to be, a little bit softer on the edges than some of the townsfolk. But they also forbid the townsfolk from hunting and gathering the animals and resources in the woods, which is kind of crazy. And this is also something that is depicted as being sacred act, to something that's a very natural and sacred act of that the pagans practiced in Bavaria at this point in time in history, previous towards the obviously the syncretism of Christianity as it proliferated throughout the continent. But it was something that the townsfolk had always done. And then you kind of see this, obviously, Father Gernot he's cracking down. He is an absolute authoritarian against the townsfolk. And that, as you said, comes up constantly as a point of tension and a point of contention at every meal.
More so in Act 2 as well.
Yeah, it starts to heat up.
One more thing that you can do that I wanted to bring up is if you sneak into the library at night to look through the records, as you're leaving, you hear somebody coming in, and it's the cantor, the monk Rudiger, Brother Rudiger,
yes,
comes in. And then Matthew comes in with them. They look around, and they immediately hook up. They start making out, and they get freaky. And you have two options here. You can either run, and they notice you, and it causes a chase scene, and then they know that you know.
Right.
Or you can stay the night. I ended up waiting it out.
I waited it out too. I did.
Sat and listened to all the blasphemous deeds going on. And upon waking up, I promptly hooked up with one of the sisters, Sister Zdenia, and got caught by Mother Illuminatia, or Sister Illuminatia.
Sister Zdenia, did you do an achievement hunting run through this game? Because that's another achievement in the game that I wished I had gotten. Really?
No,
okay.
That's just something that I did, yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Zdenia is, you learn that her family is very wealthy, which is why she kind of gets special treatment, but she doesn't take being a nun very seriously. She didn't ask for this.
Yeah.
So you guys hook up, and Illuminatia is really disappointed in you, but that's a good scene.
And something that maybe we didn't talk about as Andreas is navigating, and he's also going throughout the process of, going through the different acts throughout the day, whether it's going to the scriptorium to do his job or having meals with people to try and gather information to investigate the various perpetrators or the various suspects that are tied to the case. You also, as you had mentioned previously when you were speaking to Sister Matilda, there's a secret entrance to the library, which is very important because it has very essential information that Andreas needs to solve some of the mysteries that are at play here. And it's something that is unique to the town of Tassing, but it's the idea that continues to reoccur, is that the town was built on Roman ruins, or the ruins of a Roman town or city at that point in time. And so there's aqueducts that are off in the distance, as well as tombs that you can that you can find at different points in the main town, that is kind of the halfway point in between the town and the abbey. And there's ways that you can kind of use those tombs to sneak and find different undiscovered locations throughout the abbey.
Yeah. You, and on your playthroughs, you might not even interact with those at all. They're kind of optional. So at one point, we're told that the Archdeacon has sent some folks here, a gaggle of troops and the executioner, and you've been summoned to speak to him tomorrow. Everybody's getting interviewed about what happened. And that night, you have another dream sequence. So this is a symbol that gets used a lot, is this symbol of the maze. There's a painting called Our Lady of the Labyrinth, and it's a woman. I don't remember if it's Mother Mary or not, but she's holding a labyrinth that you are controlling Andreas in. You're controlling his portrait, and you're moving around. And so I found an article. I forget what university it's from. It'll be linked in the sources in the description. But it talked about the symbology of labyrinths in Christianity and Catholicism being sort of a showcase of entering to find the center and find yourself one with God. Right, it's a journey. But if we think about a labyrinth in a broader sense, this will become clearer in Act 2. It can also represent this idea of feeling claustrophobic and feeling lost and boxed in.
Yeah.
And that's something that we're going to see with Andreas' character more in the next act. Not so much here, but in this one, in your dream, you have a conversation with your father and your bride-to-be, Sabine. And this is where you learn that Andreas, well, this is where, one, you learn that he dropped out, but two, that he doesn't really want to go back home, and he doesn't want to marry.
Yeah, he's a little bit reticent. He doesn't quite. He has this very complex relationship with his father, and he knows that he is betrothed, as is expected of people who are of the aristocracy of that time, that you kind of have to fulfill your marital obligations according to how your family or how your parents have, determined for you in your life. And this is something that kind of it loops itself in, it folds itself neatly in with a lot of other core themes of the game, and determinism, as well as self-efficacy and reliance on the self to do things. That is something that kind of presents a problem for Andreas at this point in time, and it affects him in Act 2 very deeply.
Much more deeply in Act 2. This transitions into returning to the memory palace, the mind palace, where you're speaking with your conscience, Grobian, the patriarch, his name is Prester John, Socrates, and Beatrice. You sort of go through the evidence that you have, they'll weigh in on it, and then the day of the trial arrives. You'll be questioned. I wrote the Archdeacon. I think it's a fellow named Jacob. I don't remember his title. I don't think it's the Archdeacon, though. You give your accounts, and notably, you can choose not to speak about some people if you want. That's Brother Wojslav suggests that to you. He says, be mindful. Anybody that you bring up is going to be a suspect. So, maybe don't. Well, for him, it's maybe don't bring up Sister Matilda. But you can choose to leave people out. And what's interesting is, after what happens next, somebody talks to you, and you have the option of saying, like, that's not what I told him at all. That's not the person that I suspected, which leads me to believe that you can, like, put someone forward and they choose someone else. You know what I mean? That's never happened to me, though.
Yeah, it hasn't happened to me either. And I think that what it is like what happens when you have the conversation with the Archdeacon is that you present the evidence, and then I think they give you one more time to be like, all right, well, who do you think it is? And then as Andreas, you're able to say, okay, well, I really think because of the totality of evidence that I've gathered on X person, that they're the ones who must have done this act, who must have perpetrated this crime. And it was very contentious because obviously this conversation that you have, they call you out multiple times for being like kind of like an armchair detective. Like if you make a mistake or something like that, he'll be like, what are you doing? Who is this guy? What are you talking about? And then obviously you have to reiterate at this point. And again, this leads back into what, Rick, you had mentioned earlier in the game, is that you're given a limited amount of time. It's similar to Danganronpa in this sense. You're given a limited amount of time to determine the clues that will give you the conclusion that you can have, or at least present to the Archdeacon at the end of the game of who is responsible for what. And you're kind of, you go through the list of evidence, and obviously, as you said, the more important the clues that you gather, time is going to move forward as it naturally would. And that's something that I was curious, that I wanted to dig in with you a little bit, obviously, before we move on, but something that I was wondering, like, how did it reflect on your experience of the game? Did it frustrate you at all? Because I felt very frustrated with the fact that I couldn't play this game like an Ubisoft game and collect every single piece of evidence on every single character and then finally present all of the things. It's much more realistic than that. Andreas wouldn't have had time to do that. So I was wondering how that played with you.
So first of all, I don't mean to laugh. I keep imagining showing somebody from Tassing Danganronpa and watching the ensuing heart attack. I cannot imagine something farther from the Catholic Church than Danganronpa.
Yeah, agreed.
No, I did not have any anxiety about this at all. I loved it.
Okay.
I loved it. I would not. No part of me wanted to be. And I'm not saying this derogatorily towards you. No part of me wanted to be like the gamer that checks all the boxes and collects all the evidence, like Spyro the Dragon's this.
Right.
I didn't want to. I had no desire to do that. That's part of what makes the subsequent playthroughs on this interesting.
Yes.
You know, you gather new evidence. That's why this time I didn't go after Attilia at all. I learned everything I could about Lucky, which I had never done before. So I'm totally fine with that. You know, I'm especially these days, you know, games like Suikoden where you can miss party members, Chrono Cross, that doesn't bother me as much anymore.
Interesting.
You know?
Okay.
If it's plot, like if there are like hard plot and lore things that you can miss, that bothers me.
Yeah.
So I do often use walkthroughs on like secondary playthroughs with JRPGs. But yeah, no, I liked it. I was a fan.
Yeah, I think just being an avid gamer and playing different narrative games throughout this point, and obviously playing RPGs like Mass Effect or, you know, Ubisoft games to that effect, I've been infected with this mind flayer worm in my brain that says you must gather all the evidence, you must gather all pieces of information, and it's like my dark urge to, you know, play these games and
Ubisoft brainworm.
Exactly, try to do that. But I agree with you to the extent where it's like I felt that stress initially because it felt like, you know, going before the Archdeacon, like I had done everything that I could according to how much time I had at my disposal as Andreas, but I felt like I was a kid walking into like an interview for the first time, not knowing anything about the job, or like not or taking a test without having studied the night before. And that's what it felt like. And then once you kind of realize, you get to this point where it's you are the one that determines the course of events, and who to accuse, who to blame, who eventually the Archdeacon is going to put to the sword. You start to realize that nothing is clear. You're not given any answers. The game is not going to be, oh, you're wrong, you got it wrong, it was actually this person. No, they don't do that, which is actually quite beautiful.
And that's what I meant earlier when I said that it subverts this, is that you don't get to know who actually did it. You know, nobody fesses up. I mean, everybody says that they didn't do it if you ask them, but that's not the point. You know, that's not how it would have happened back then. And that's not the point that Josh Sawyer and his team are trying to make. It's, you know, you did the best that you could. This is how history is being written now.
Yeah. This
is how history will be remembered because of your actions. Now, how do we move forward from that?
Yeah.
This game is so thematically focused in that way.
Did you find, obviously, as we move forward, whoever you choose to accuse, did you find that certain townfolk treated you drastically different in Act 2?
Well, in Act 2, when the midwife is needed, since I chose Lucky, somebody's like, Andreas, get the midwife. I was like, she doesn't really like me, so I don't think I should be the one to do this.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were moments, obviously, with me having chosen Prior Phrenic to accuse, and obviously they have like it's very visceral, the final speech of the given accusee, the person who is kind of like put before the townsfolk before they're summarily executed. They're usually pleading, they're usually crying, begging for their life. I don't see Lucky doing that, honestly, because he's such
Lucky did not. He just he kneels and says, Lord, take me. And they lop off his head pretty cleanly.
Yeah.
Attilia comes in and she's like, I didn't do it, but damn you all to hell. I fucking hate all of you. And they strangle her. Ferenc is the only one that's like really struggling, and his execution is the most brutal because he's running around and he's like, I didn't do it.
Yeah.
The executioner's like, dude, stand still. You're going to make this harder. And it takes more than one swing to get his head off.
It's rough. And I was like, oh my God. Yeah. Like you feel the guilt, especially because of how ardent he was, or how kind of just how he was so adamant about the fact that he was an innocent man in this situation, despite what he may have done, that he didn't kill them. And I'm sitting here thinking, as I'm playing Andreas, oh my God, I messed this whole thing up. But you're never really given any indication that you're actually wrong, which is just so, it's mind-boggling when you think about like playing a game and from a detective story point of view.
Yeah. It's what makes this game so special.
Yeah.
So after the execution, you are leaving Tassing. You say your goodbyes to Piero. You show him your masterpiece. You've painted yourself in, the townsfolk, like Big Jorg and Peter. You painted things as they are, not as they should be. So right. Piero is so pleased. You find one more purple note that says, do not return here. Dun, dun, dun.
Wow.
And that puts us into Act 2. Act 2 takes place 7 years later. Andreas comes back with short hair and a beard now, fancy clothes, the title of master, and an apprentice named Caspar. When you come back here, you can visit Piero's grave. There's a line here that is just so poignant that it punched me in the stomach. It stopped me in my tracks. You stop at your grave, and Caspar is asking you about Piero, and you tell him that you're thinking of him, but, quote, it doesn't come as easily anymore. Yeah. That just slapped me in the face. You know, this isn't a theme, but it's an observation that is so human. Just there are events in my life that mean a lot to me that I think of, and I think to myself, like, I can't picture this as vividly anymore. And that's a scary thing to think about.
It is.
We don't have pentimenti in our. I don't mean to interrupt you. We don't have pentimenti in our brains. Once that image is gone, it's gone.
And it kind of gives you an immediate understanding of where Andreas' headspace is. Like, he's not a happy man because of his life in Tassing before, obviously, where he is now. And he's not, and it's also like it's just that there is this sullen nature of where we are as Andreas at this point in time, you know, walking through the town with Caspar and seeing it. And I agree. I couldn't agree with you more that this was just, you know, beautifully done. And it's like these things happen as moments in time and then they fade away. It's something that Josh Sawyer had kind of reiterated in describing the development of this game. You know, he talks about history has a fragile nature to it. And at any moment in time, either with with obviously just years passing throughout the the course of our lives, we lose things and they don't come back. Even if we want to hang on to them, these things we lose people and we lose things and we lose touch with where we were at any given moment in time, and it's really sad.
It's sad. It's unavoidable.
Yeah.
And it's not something that many people like to reckon with.
It's real life.
You get to choose your background again, where you spent your last 7 years. I chose Poland. That's where I was. I have Polish knowledge. Spent some time in Basel, I think, is another one. I don't remember the other options. I know England is one. I think Italy.
Yeah, I think I did the same thing. I believe I remember Italy and Basel. I thought there might have been an option where I could have worked with a master's in Spain, potentially, and I think that might have been something that I chose. But yeah, that was about it.
The scriptorium at this point has been shut down. It's become a victim to time. It was inevitable. The abbey is barely surviving, so much so that the abbot is raising taxes again and has asked Andreas, even after everything that happened, to come back and buy some of their books just to help keep things afloat. And it's around here where Andreas begins to express his character directly to Caspar. We learn that we're not role-playing. He says that he doesn't want to return to Nuremberg. He's dreading it. He says, my patrons just want to celebrate themselves. I dread each new commission more than the last. Every step I take toward home is agonizing. He, of course, doesn't bring up the, other things that we learn later, but Andreas is so much deeper than what we may have thought before.
Yeah.
Marriage. Caspar could never understand this. He looks up to you unconditionally, and how you treat him determines whether or not he survives, and it's not in the way that you think.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you are kind to Caspar, he will eventually die.
Really?
Yes, you have to be mean to him in order to get him to escape one of the later scenarios.
Interesting. Okay.
Otherwise you fail that check and he dies.
I rode the line of being a little bit shitty to Caspar, as kind of like picking and choosing my teaching, quote unquote, teaching moments, to kind of be gruff with him, as well as to kind of be a little bit gentler at any given moment in time. It is interesting. The relationship between Caspar and Andreas is honestly one of the most fascinating moments in the game. Obviously, it's not a father-son relationship, but it is an authority figure, and in like a male to younger male authority figure. This is really important, and it's fascinating to kind of look at it from a historical perspective that he would take on an apprentice like Caspar at this point in time. I would imagine that he may have gone through the same thing, but that's never clearly communicated. But that's so interesting that he, depending on how you treat Caspar, is what determines his survival. I hate that, though. I hate if you want to be nice to him, that just will lead to his death. That's terrible.
Yeah.
Terrible game design.
Oh, come on.
I'm kidding. Of course, it's wonderful game design. But
So we've talked about the theme of the passage of time, and as you go through town here on your second time here, you're going to see town members that you see them grown up now, starting families of their own.
yeah.
If you attend something I forgot to mention, if you attend lunch with Brother Sabhat, he is an Ethiopian monk on visit to the Abbey who is drawn in an Ethiopian style.
Yes.
He will give a reading to the townspeople of the story of the resurrection of Jesus, and it's all depicted with Ethiopian people. And he has a moment where somebody's like, "Why are they brown?" And he's like, "Well, God makes colors of all kinds of people. This this is what the beautiful people of my home look like." And there's a moment where a little girl named Anna can steal Andreas's hat.
Yeah.
And if you let her keep it, she has it when you come back 7 years later.
Oh, that's so
and it's
cute.
it's patched up a little bit.
Yeah.
It's really nice.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Again, it's like they do the children here so wonderfully, and obviously the Ethiopian monk who's a part of this scene is just, it's very, very interesting and beautiful, and it's something that obviously it quite clearly reiterated, or just a simple fact about history is that we had different African scholars that were traveling, or Middle Eastern scholars that were traveling all over Europe during this time, and it is the conflagration, or the combination of the backgrounds, but the widespread nature of Christianity at that time is what brought all of these people together, and I love how that was represented here at this point in time.
It's really nice, yeah. We learn here too that Andreas hasn't written back to folks very much, like Otto and Klaus.
Yes.
People start to resent him more. And Brother Guy has a great line here. Like, he's still seen as somebody that's like sticking his nose into other people's affairs. And Brother Guy says, "It's easy enough for you to come and go, but we have to live with it here," which is great. I mean, Andreas is not some do-gooder. Like, people don't respond to him in that way.
This is something that I'm glad that you brought that up, because I wanted to reiterate, is when I came back for Act 2, obviously spending a good chunk of time in Act 1 figuring out what I was doing, figuring out who to talk to, how to, relay whatever I needed to do at any given time throughout the game, and learning just about the histories and the backgrounds and forming relationships, whether it's good or bad, or friendships with the people. I was expecting to start Act 2 up. We're back in Tassing. I'm older. I'm wiser. I'm a artistic master. I have my apprentice with me. I'm going to be welcomed back with open arms again. I can't wait to see the Gertners. I can't wait to see the Druckers. And then people are very ambivalent, if not outright kind of dismissive of the fact that you're back in town. They're like, "Oh, here's this guy again coming in," and it's just as you said, it's easy for him to come
not everybody.
And go.
There are plenty of folks that are happy to see him.
Yeah. You're right. There are some. I just was expecting maybe a little bit more camaraderie, a little bit more familiarity, but I think the reaction that Andreas got when he came back to town was just very natural and very real, and I was taken aback by that, I guess is my point.
Oh yeah, no, I understand what you mean entirely. It's a really nice I'm glad that they went that route. Klaus had a daughter named Magdalene. We're going to meet her more later. That's just something I wanted to put in there. There's a meeting in town. So concerns from the peasants are growing. They can barely afford to eat. Dinner with the Gertners, only Andreas and Caspar got bread, and Peter freaked out whenever Caspar tried to give it to, I forget the kid's name. Anna, maybe? I can't remember. Ursula, that's it.
Right.
So nobody can afford to eat anymore. The taxes are just too high. And there's a meeting in the town square that night, and it's Otto rallying everybody into a revolt.
Yep.
They've raised the death tax. They can't pay with goods anymore. It's just coin. They're not allowed to forage and hunt in the woods anymore, which goes against Christian law, moral law, like God's law. They can't do this. They are going to revolt against the church. And the church knows about this, and they're not happy about it. Father Gernot is going to put his foot down. Otto specifically says, "I have proof that God is on my side," and he tells everybody who will listen this, literally everybody. So again, genre savvy people probably know what's coming.
Yep.
Sister Amelie has another vision as you pass by. Again, this is kind of setting up the same cycle. Something that's interesting is that Sister Amelie is kind of characteristically opposed to Andreas, right? I mean, she's chosen this life, cloistered in this one room forever, digging her own grave, bit by bit, every day she'll be buried there. And she's chosen this out of pure devotion, this life of meager living. Whereas Andreas, who wants for naught, is falling out of love with art, which is, there's merit to that. I'm not dismissing that at all because I have experienced this, but it drives home that his problems are so disconnected from the real world problems of the people here. He has a lack of perspective that really shines in this act.
Yeah, it's a lack of perspective that's not only underscored by the struggles that all of the different families are experiencing, like the fact that he doesn't like his wife, compared to the fact that some of these townsfolk cannot afford to buy bread from the local baker to put on their table, is like just so there's just so much disparity there. And at several points in time, Caspar actually takes Andreas like to task for it. He has like subtle ways of reminding Andreas, well, maybe you're just not seeing it from the perspective of the townsfolk. A lot of the times Caspar is a little bit in the background, but he does kind of serve as a sounding board of what it's like to be a young man seeing it. And obviously he's protected, through the guise of where he's seeing, Andreas or the fact that he is Andreas's apprentice. And so he has this type of social shielding around him as he's interfacing with the folks throughout the town. But he also, it seems that the young apprentice has a little bit more of his finger on the pulse as to where people are and what's going on than Andreas does. His head is still firmly wedged up his own ass, and he's meddling in things he doesn't understand again.
Yes. Yeah. Lots more of that to come too. You start finding letters again. The first one says you were warned. So this whole thing is starting up again. You have dinner with Klaus that evening. It's very tense because, you haven't written back. You do get his daughter Magdalene a gift from the library, which is nice of you. But their guests are a Jewish couple, Benjamin and Rachel. You learn a little bit about the printing press that Klaus has gotten going. And they're looking for a Hebrew typeface, a Yiddish typeface. Rachel goes into labor here. It's a bit of comedy because Klaus keeps going to get the midwife, and then he's like, "Oh, by the way, Andreas, you should check this out." And she's like, "Come on," she's like, "Go fucking get the midwife."
Yeah,
it's a good bit of comedy, but it's important that she's in labor just because of something that happens later. This evening, the town is preparing for St. John's Eve. A St. John's Eve festival, despite the abbot forbidding foraging in the forest, that's just part of the tradition. They basically tell Father Thomas, "Too bad, we're doing it," and Father Guinot is intent on excommunicating everybody. This does that. This festival is pretty pagan inspired. Like there's a bonfire and people dress up in masks. In light of the legend that the wild hunt comes through and anybody not wearing a mask will be taken, that kind of thing. And it's just a time where everybody's having a good time in the square, and you get to talk to everybody. You meet Werner and Balthazar.
Yeah.
Werner is kind of a dickhead. He's not very nice to anybody. You speak to Martin, who is kind of shaped up, seemingly.
Yeah. Brand new renewed Martin.
In more than one way, yeah. And he's he's got a girl, he's got a lady.
That's right.
and they're making very uncomfortable flirting just in front of everybody.
I love how real that is too. It's like, come on, you see, 20 somethings. Like, can you calm down a little bit? Can you go back inside your house?
One of the options you can say to them after Martin says something too sexual is just two asterisks stares quizzically asterisk. I was like, yeah, that's what I would do too.
Yeah.
So this all happens. You're invited to have dinner with the abbot that evening. He tries to get you on his side. You don't go to his side, but depending on how you want to play Andreas, you can either tell him to go to hell or, be more receptive. Like, I understand times are hard. Maybe you should talk with the peasants, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I chose to be in this moment in time. I really didn't like the abbot. I didn't like the abbot in Act 1, and I particularly don't like him now, seeing as how he's leaning more heavily into being an authoritarian within this town. And so I definitely took the moment to just try and be a little bit mindful of like, okay, they want me to play as a bureaucrat here. Let me try to be deft, and so I tried to politic a little bit and tell him to not choose the slash and burn route, and rather try to convince him to consider the townsfolk's opinions.
So the bonfire goes. Everybody has a good time. You get another dream sequence this night. Caspar stays out. He asks, and you let him. And you have another dream sequence. This is going to be the final thing we cover. This is also my favorite two scenes in this entire game. So it starts in the labyrinth again. We talked a little bit about the imagery of that before. We're now solidly into this not representing finding oneself through Christ, but this idea of feeling trapped and claustrophobic. Andreas never wanted this life for himself. It's full of tragedy. And what we learn here is you speak to Sabine first, your wife. Things aren't happy at home. She doesn't believe that you ever loved her, and one of the responses you can say is it was never about that. And what you learn is that August, your first child, died of the plague.
Yeah.
He appears in this dream, and you learn that he appears every single night. Every night. I think Andreas at one point says, please, just one night without this dream. He doesn't speak because you've never heard him speak. He wasn't old enough to speak when he died.
Right.
It's just, you can make him bitter or resentful here, or tired or broken. It's some of the hardest hitting dialogue in the game. One of my favorite lines in the game, when you're talking to August, you have a choice to say, can you ever picture someone clearly if you love them, or can you ever picture someone clearly if you hate them? And it's not clear. Are we talking about August? He's because at one point, if you select the former, he says, I loved you so much. I wish that I would die so I wouldn't have to feel this pain anymore. Is he talking about himself? Is he talking about Sabine? It could be any of these people.
Yeah.
And it's just really hard hitting.
Yeah, this is again, kind of to reiterate a point that we have brought up earlier, is that they wrote real people into the story. This is such a human thing to experience. Not only is it a human thing to experience, it's like we are inside of the mind space of Andreas right now, and we truly understand that this young, plucky, witty, somewhat talented artist that we met in Act 2 has lived a life, and he has experienced the tragedy and the hardship that comes with living in Europe at this point in history. And it is so touching. And it's also really important to kind of set out that, to have this understanding of who Andreas is at this point in time, because that's going to allow you to kind of figure out how you want to play him as you move forward, how you want him to interact with people. Are you going to be a bitter, hateful individual, or are you going to try and do the right thing? The right thing with a, very heavy quotation marks, right? Because it's unclear what is right, what is good or bad. And I think that that's so just heavily, just well represented in this space at this point in time. And I couldn't agree with you more again, Rick, about the fact that I felt that one of the strongest points of this game is whenever he does go into his memory palace, whenever he does go into I think they call it the city of thought, or they have a name for the city that he goes into every time, as well as the fool's ship. But these imaginary characters, these imaginary spaces that he occupies are so important to kind of who he is and who we want to shape Andreas to be. And yeah, it is incredibly sad to understand this is where he is. Not to mention the fact that he's in a loveless marriage that resulted into the death of a child, and that he no longer loves the thing that he devoted his life to becoming. He no longer loves doing the art, and it's like he's listless, he's lost, and it's another reason why you begin this moment in the labyrinth, because he doesn't know where to go, he doesn't know what to do, and he finds himself back here, in Tassing once again.
He's a tragic character,
yeah,
and he's fallen into somewhat of a depression because of it, and we see this now in the Memory Palace or the City of Thought or whatever. It's now completely decrepit. It's in ruins, destroyed totally. The fools from St. Grobian Ship of Fools have all just imbibed in alcohol and are laying around drunk, passed out. And all that remains is this new woman who looks like Beatrice, but much, much larger, like a giant, named, literally taking up the entire space, which, is appropriate. This is Melancholia. I heard Josh Sawyer say this in one of his talks. I couldn't find this cited anywhere else, but because of his credentials, I have no reason not to, believe him. Melancholia was how people in this time referred to depression. Depression was not something that existed as an identity or a social or linguistically recognized thing back then, but it still existed. And melancholia was how they referred to that. So this woman of Melancholia is all that remains in Andreas's mind palace. And in speaking to her, you ask who she is, and she says, "I was a voice of caution, of prudence." And you say, "And now?" And she continues, "More and less than caution, the ache of doubt that stiffens to paralysis, paralysis that breeds despair. What happens to you happens to us. The foundations of this city are still moored within the ocean of your mind. Once reason, curiosity, and the foolishness of youth dwelt under the aegis of your intellect. I am all that remains, the melancholy of life's autumn."
That's so powerful.
Beautiful writing. And it characterizes this idea of depression so well. Andreas has been through unimaginably traumatic experiences. Falling out of love with a passion, the death of one's child. And the result of this is he's not even safe in his dreams anymore. It's shaped his psyche in such a way that all that can dwell there is this massive presence of melancholia. Paralysis that breeds despair, the ache of doubt that stiffens to paralysis that breeds despair. What a characterization. That is the perfect characterization of what this sort of mindset feels like.
Yeah.
And here we have it represented, and we're literally in this character's psyche, and we get to experience this right after learning about his marriage and the death of his son. And him essentially having suicidal ideation, not wanting to be alive anymore.
Right.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah, I definitely at this point in time realized that once I hit this moment, I was like, I was thinking to myself as I was playing it, this game is next level. Like, this game is clearly, cut from a different cloth, from a lot of experiences that you would go into. And I think that depression is something that has actually been very well represented in the indie space, for video games at large. But for this game specifically, I think that it's handling this with enough depth and enough care that it's just so believable to realize what Andreas is going through and how stuck he is and how constrained he is. And it also, from the player perspective, it puts you in this mind space. Well, you're starting to think we're back in Tassing maybe for a reason. Maybe that's why we were able to get away from the city. And I think that is something maybe narratively that they talk about, that he's trying to feel re-inspired to work on some of the commissions that he's working through again. And it might have been some of the motives for him to come back. You could probably correct me if there's a additional or alternative reason for that. But
no, I think you got it. It's self-preservation, right?
Yeah.
He cannot spend another minute there. It's a constant reminder of the reality of his life. Escaping to Tassing is essentially taking a step back into time. Yeah, a lot of people aren't fond that he's there, but he feels comfortable there. He feels safe.
Right.
It's self-preservation.
It is. It is. And I think that it's something that is I've experienced this in my life. I've experienced things where it's like I physically could not stay another day in the city that I was living in, and I knew that, and I did everything that I possibly could to move and try to, gain a little bit more of a worldview and see what the rest of the world outside of this town that I've grown up in is actually like. And I kind of I empathize a lot. I haven't, of course, lived anywhere close to what you would imagine that Andreas has lived, but this is everything he's experiencing is just such a human experience in the way.
Right, we're circling back to that theme that, the past isn't quite as distant as we think it is.
And is it doomed to repeat itself? Are we doomed to repeat the mistakes that we have seen people throughout history make time and time again? Have we been able to decipher the truth through the loss that we've experienced? And I think that this is where Andreas is the perfect place for him to be at this point in the narrative.
Yeah, well said. It's really heavy, and it characterizes him in a completely new light. It's my favorite scene in this game. I kind of think these two scenes work together perfectly.
Yeah. I will say one more thing. You draw the comparison to Disco Elysium previously. This scene reminds me so much of the end of Disco Elysium.
Absolutely.
As when Harry kind of has that final confrontation with the figure, the woman, in his
Dolores
memory.
Day.
Yeah, Dolores Day. And this is very, very, in that same vein, in that same kind of, space of feeling and thinking, that anybody who could enjoy any part of that game is there. This is a must play. This is a must recommend, particularly because of this scene.
Yeah, that's another game that deals with the weight of the past. It's just in a different way.
Yeah.
Really good stuff. So that's where we're going to stop for today. I wanted to make sure that I got through that. Starting with that scene would have been kind of jarring, and I didn't want to just end on Act 1.
Right.
Makes the next episode a little bit easier. But the next episode will begin with the inciting incident of Act 2. Another murder is going to take place, and we are going to solve it, whether or not anybody likes it.
Exactly.
Tune in next time. We will cover from there to the very end of the game. If you have any questions until then, comments, if you want to discuss the game, the episode, please, by all means, join our Discord, be a part of the conversation. It is free. You can find that link in the episode description, along with the sources for this episode, our other social medias such as Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, if you like to use that, things of that nature. You can also find our Patreon if you like what the show does and want to be a supporter and get some nice benefits. You can do that as well at patreon.com/pixelprojectradio. Nick, I want to thank you again for joining. You are one half of Friday Night Gamecast. You and Will were previously on the show together for Hades, which I had a lot of fun. I've been itching to replay that. Friday Night Gamecast is a fantastic show. Do you want to plug anything that you are currently doing or any new releases from Friday Night Gamecast?
Absolutely. We're working through some things right now. Obviously, our lineup, we have a full slate of reviews of both backlog games as well as more recent games. We did a wonderful review of Dragon's Dogma 2 with Matt Stormageddon. They joined us for that episode, and that was just such a blast to join them for. And then we also, the most recent episode that we dropped on the podcast was our review of Fire Emblem Fates, the infamous game in the Fire Emblem franchise, if you're at all familiar with JRPGs. And then we also have a nice indie take if you want to check out our review of Tales of Kanzera Zhao. And then previously, right before that, if you're all familiar with our show, we kind of do this blend of doing deep dive review podcasts that Rick does so excellently, as well as talking about more topical industry related matters. So Will and I had a wonderful, very heated conversation on whether or not we could call Game of the Year 2024 already. And so that's some stuff that you can expect from us if you want to check us out. We are just Friday Night Gamecast on all your podcast catchers. And if you wanted to reach out or find more about us or see my crazy retweets on Twitter, then we are just at FNGC Pod there.
Absolutely check them out. It's a great show. I was listening to I haven't finished that episode, but I'm liking everything that I'm hearing so far. Fantastic show. You can find all of their links in the episode description to their socials and to their feed as well. So please do check them out. Reviews, if you want to review the show and have your review read on air, by all means, please do. I have a new aggregating site where I have more information, and today's review comes from Nomad, who also reviewed a while ago on Podchaser, and I hadn't seen it until I found this new review site. So I'm just reading one from Nomad, but both 5 stars. He says, I've been hooked on pixelprojectradio for a while now. Rick puts together some great discussions around video games, and I always end an episode either having learned something new, heard a new and entertaining perspective on a game I like, or just felt thoroughly entertained. If you're looking for a podcast that's informative, thoughtful, and sometimes funny, okay, that's generous, but give Pixel Project Radio a listen. Thank you, Nomad. Nomad has a great show of his own, The Retro Wildlands. I appreciate you listening, Nomad. You can hear more of him on our Parasite Eve coverage if you are interested, and more in the future. But for today, that's all. Next time, we will finish Pentiment and all of the discussions that come with it. Nick, thanks for joining me again. So pleased to have somebody else on the show that loves this game.
Thanks for having me again, Rick.
The pleasure is mine. So until next time, take care.
Nach dir ist mir so weh, tröst mir mein Gemüte, o puer Optime, durch alle deine Güte, o Princeps Gloriae, traene poste.